to our Kenneth Smith series of seminars. This big arc, multi-year arc, is us going through his book Millennia and Microcosm, which has not yet been published as a book. All of the chapters of the book, however, were previously published as columns in a column called End Times between 1998 and 2000 in the Comics Journal. And David and I are in the process of pulling it together into a book for Kenneth. And in this seminar, we are working our way chapter by chapter through all of the ideas. And part of what we're doing is slowing down and unpacking the text to show how Kenneth Smith's writing style is very dense, deliberately dense. He's trying to mimic Nietzsche and Hegel and Heraclitus and others, so that each sentence says, well, the famous quote from Nietzsche is that Nietzsche wants to say in 10 sentences what other people say in a book. And then Nietzsche says, what other people don't say in a book. So, text that you're not wasting your time with because it's got a lot to say. The sentences are worth chewing on. So we got through the first 3 paragraphs last week. We got that far in section F. The section F is called Mythos and Logos. It's part of chapter 4, Ancient Civilization. In this book, Kenneth Smith is taking us on a tour of 3 different epochs of human history, each of which has its own very distinct worldview. And part of his argument, drawing off of Hegel here, is that the differences are not simply that ours is better than theirs, which is what moderns assume about the modern worldview. Rather, it's that each worldview is better at some things and worse at others, which is a shocking idea to a modern, that we could be worse at anything. We're supposed to be the best at everything. That's what modern means. Everybody else is obsolete and we're up to date and modern. So what he's doing in this book is helping us to consider the idea that any single human worldview is both a useful tool, but also a trap, because you come to take its weaknesses for granted as though they're showing you reality the way it really is. Hi, Joseph. And they're not. It's looking at reality through any worldview, through any finite mortal worldview, is inherently a funhouse mirror exercise. Another metaphor that occurred to me this last week was the Hubble telescope, when it first went up, had distortions in its mirrors, and it wasn't able to deliver the view of the cosmos that had been promised. And so it took a while for them to send up another mission to get that corrected. And as I recall, there's also some software correction they were able to do, where they could understand the nature of the warpage and use software to unwarp the image to put it back towards what it might have been like if the mirror had gone up clean. So this entire book is an exercise in this same behavior, getting us to understand that the way we see the world is not objectivity and truth itself. We are not gods of reason. We are finite mortal people, and we see in very shockingly limited ways. And so if we can learn to not be trapped in a single worldview, but to be able to pick ourselves up and try different worldviews to look at different problems, or even to look at the same problem from one worldview and then another, it will help us to unwarp our understanding of reality. Chapter 4 is one of the 3 epochs he's going to do, Ancient Civilization. This is the densest part of the book because he's trying to cover an entire epoch of history and an entire worldview in one chapter. After this, in chapters 5 through I forget how far, he'll do the medieval worldview. And then in the final chapters of the book, he'll do the modern worldview. So we have, since we're in section F, we've already gone through A, B, C, D, and E, talking about different aspects of the ancient worldview that are intensely different from the modern worldview. And it takes a while, with each of these elements, it takes a while to see how the ancients are not seeing the world the same way that we are, but they're also not seeing the world in a more primitive way than we are, that they're seeing the world in a different way, standing in a different position than we are. And as a result, some things they see less well and other things they see more clearly than we do. So section F is exploring the topic of mythos and logos, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm not the greatest mind around, that's for sure. I've spent the last few years trying to have a bit of intense look through some philosophical subjects. And something that's running through everything, politics, a whole lot, the news, everything you're looking through, is a weakness in distinguishing between object and subject. For example, the rationalists will always rave on about their masterful view of the universe. And one would have to question, hey, rationalists, yeah, you're talking about the objective universe, but the instrument you're looking through, man, that piece of meat down the funnel somewhere, has its limitations. But they don't seem to get into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, let's take a moment to talk about this. I'm going to just put a little capsule here about the title of section F. For people who are just joining us. Here we go. All right, so mythos and logos. From the logos, i.e. rationalist culture position, to be irrationalist is to be stupid and bad and wrong and the cause of all evil in the world. And to be rationalist is to be sane and objective and good, the source of all goodness in the world. Moderns have really modernity is an epoch that generates hyper logos Apollonian hyper rationalist cultures that believe that everything can be reduced to equations or logical syllogisms or systems of laws, and that the goal in structuring society is to create a perfect system of laws such that people have really negligible amounts of free will. They will just follow the laws, and by following the laws, goodness will surely follow us all the days of our lives. Only good things could happen from this approach. And the way that we'll develop those laws is that we'll all get together either directly in assemblies or through representatives, and we will vote. And that from this political activity of voting, the result will be that majorities will only ever vote for good things, or if they make a mistake, it'll be a small mistake, and they'll figure it out quickly. That whenever you find out what large numbers of people want, the result is always virtue and goodness. And so the laws that they create will create a system of virtue and goodness in which there's really no need for individuality or free will. We all just need to follow the laws, and that will ensure that a good society is the result. Now, most of this, modernists and ultra-rationalists don't ever think consciously to themselves, and they don't say it out loud because it actually doesn't sound very nice if you say it out loud. These are things that they believe but are careful never to think clearly about. Our modes of thinking about what we're doing when we think, our modes of thinking about rationalism and irrationalism, they're all on little tracks following thought-terminating cliche, on their way to thought-terminating cliches in order to shut down this entire line of investigation. Because the more you investigate it, the less good it sounds. So instead, we're sort of taught these catechisms about how you're supposed to think about these things. And you think about them in a way that leads you as quickly as possible to a conclusion that sounds like motherhood and apple pie. This is a thought-terminating cliche to ensure that you don't think any further. We're done now. We've arrived at the goodness, and so let's stop thinking. So issues like, if rationalism and education lead to goodness, then why was it the Nazis? Why was it Germany, the most scientifically advanced and most rational and technologically advanced country in the world, that did the Holocaust? Why wasn't it somewhere backwards and irrational? And the modernist explanation for the Holocaust is, well, they may have had rationality, but bigotry is a form of hatred. Hatred is emotion. Emotion is irrationality. Irrationality is the source of all bad things. Ergo, their rationality was contaminated by irrationality, and that's where the evil part of World War II came from. If they hadn't had that hatred and bigotry, then they would have been purely rational, and so they never could have done a Holocaust. This flies in the face of the testimony of Hannah Arendt, who wrote who wrote both The Origins of Totalitarianism and who also wrote Eichmann and Jerusalem. And the second book in particular is the more important one, because her testimony is that Eichmann was not a hate-mongering, crazy, irrational person. He was perfectly ordinary in every way that a modern would call somebody ordinary. He wanted to do a good job at what he was hired to do. He was interested in what the standards of his job were and being promoted. He wanted to be, you start thinking about people who fit into the system and are not rocking the boat, not biting the hand that feeds them, people who are obeying the laws, who are pursuing the goals of their administration. And Eichmann is like a poster child for rationality from that standpoint. You see this in modern discussions of racism, where the assumption is that the only people who could be racist are hateful people. And so you get this political divide between one side saying, you all must be hateful to be doing these things, and the other side saying, I don't feel any hate. I mean, I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't actually walk around twirling my mustache and rubbing my hands together going, wah, I'm going to get those people. And none of this actually describes the nature of racism, institutionalized racism in the modern world. You can find people like that, and every time we do, we make them a poster boy and say, see, this is what racism is. But it puts us in a position where we're unable to explain how large numbers of people who bear no personal animus or hatred whatsoever nevertheless obey systems that produce racist outcomes, which nobody is capable of explaining. This is what the whole critical race theory debate's about. So this issue of rationalist versus irrationalist and mythos versus logos, all of this is tied up with questions that are not only important to the Greeks, which is what this chapter is investigating, the Greeks, the Romans, and other ancient civilizations. It's not only important to us historically because of the Holocaust and institutionalized slavery before that, and the genocide in Australia, North America, South America before that. It's current events. It's literally defining the shape of the political debates happening today, but in a way that moderns are misunderstanding and not clearly talking about. Both sides leap as quickly as they can to their political brand's thought-terminating cliche, which typically involves stereotyping the other side of the debate in ways that don't actually describe them very well. And then both sides just hammer at each other through election after election, trying to do a tug of war for who gets to impose their policies. And in none of this is there any real self-awareness of the dangers of rationality. Not dangers as in we should all never be rational and it's a bad thing and we should exterminate it. That's the law of the excluded middle in action again, which comes naturally to moderns. But rather the idea that, and I'm going to sabotage this tool metaphor in a few minutes, but first I'll use this tool metaphor, like a skill saw or an electric drill. The very thing that gives us this power, rationality, is also the thing that can hurt us very, very badly. There's the idea that there are two sides, and one side only has good things in it and nothing bad, and the other side only has bad things in it and nothing good, is a weirdly cartoonish way of looking at the world. And yet to moderns, it's a reflex. It's part of our system of thought-terminating cliches. We almost can't stop ourselves from doing it. And so when people say, oh, be rational, or he's just irrational, when they do these things, they're falling back on these thought-terminating cliches that save them from having to think clearly about what is the nature of rationality and what is the nature of all the things that rationality lumps together as irrational and therefore bad. So this chapter is going to explore this section, F, is exploring the ancient perspective on this very question, talking about it as mythos versus logos. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, this leads me to think about Hegel in a funny way. I mean, I guess one of the things you could compliment Hegel is that sublation is not the same as negation, right? In other words, on the one hand, you have to live in the moment of zeitgeist, and that zeitgeist has a dominant movement, and but sublation allows it to, in a sense, sublimate, perhaps that's an easier word to understand, the differences so that the movement could maintain a kind of dominance. My question is, at what point the sublation actually becomes negation, kind of a slow motion negation? Because once it becomes a zeitgeist, as you say, then it becomes institutionalized in the zeitgeist. And even though although in some circumstances, certainly with the Jews in Nazi Germany, you go out and you actually negate the other. But in a more reasonable situation is sublation by just slowly strangling the sublation that maintains the other thing. And that leads to me to think that, in a sense, Hegel, in some sense, is got it partially right, but in some sense is also, in a sense, insufficient, because a slow motion strangle is not negation, is not burning people at the stake, but nonetheless, a slow burn in the embers accomplish the same thing over the long term. And this leads me to think about the nature of mankind as such, that, like, it wasn't that long, well, through our history, the first modernity, the sort of like understanding of the evolution of mankind is, slowly progressed to a higher level, so till we get to, Homo sapiens, the wise man, and so forth. And so there's a direct line, and now we find out that it's much more diverse than that. That, in a sense, there were moments when a number of human species, or species of mankind, coexisted. Well, maybe I shouldn't say coexisted. They existed at the same time. Coexisted means that they integrate at the same time. But what made it so that, in some sense, somewhere around 35,000 years ago, suddenly there only is one humankind. I mean, so there is something, I'm sure there was quite a lot of negation, conflict, and there probably was some degree of integration and sublation, and they disappear. I mean, because they have found Neanderthal genes within certain populations. I mean, not a whole dominant amount. So there's some integration, some sort of sublation, if you want to say. They didn't wipe them out, but somehow they got eliminated. And so the Denisovans also the same thing in Eastern Hemisphere as well. So I guess I want to find out to what degree sublation really is a kind of integration, and to what degree it actually, in the long run, it becomes a negation, in that sense. So I guess that exposes a kind of incompleteness in Hegel, even though it certainly is a better move than, let's say, direct elimination. Just kill them all. So that's my comment. So
thank you, Phil. It's an important comment, and I'm not going to do justice to it yet. And the reason is that so I've started a long-term project. I've started translating Hegel's philosophy of Geist, not the phenomenology, but his philosophy, section 3 from the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, because I just hate the translations of Hegel so badly. I hate them so much. The fact that he's using terms for which there's no English equivalent, but the translators are still operating according to the faith that English can say everything that German can, we're just as good in every respect. And therefore, we should not coin or borrow any terms at all. We should only somehow shoehorn every one of his very carefully chosen terms into some English term that doesn't fit it at all. Results in this gibberish as you try to read it. And so I'm working on a new approach to translating him, in which some words are kept in German or Greek, or something is coined for them where we just don't have an equivalent. And that when we run across them, we take time in the text. We have a call out section and say, here is this term and let's talk about it. Because it's, the goal of saying, well, you can just read right through this translation just like you'd read anything in English, that's not acceptable for something like Hegel. It's not doable. He needs to be unpacked. So I'm working on that. And as part of that, I'm starting to pick apart the structure of his German terminology, and what is the normal German he's speaking, and where is the German specialized and being used in an odd way. Sublation of course, is one of those places, and so is negation. So when I get further through this project, I'll understand better exactly when and where he uses the terms and how they relate to each other. I can certainly talk about it now, but if I do, I'm going to be talking from a position of ignorance compared to, just 6 months from now, I'll be able to say something smarter on this. So I'm gonna wait, Phil, until I have something useful to add, because you're already capable of approaching Hegel the way I approach Hegel, which is, we read what's available to us and, work our way through it. I want to create something that's not available to us and see if that gives us any more insight into this question. But the general impression that I have so far agrees with you that sublation is a more sophisticated operation than negation. Negation is like one step in the dialectics, but to get to sublation, it takes at least two. I believe. I'm not certain. I believe, based on my reading so far. We'll see. We'll unpack this more as we go. Geneva, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
I just have a simple question. I wanted to know exactly what time period we're referring to when you say the moderns. I'm a little bit confused by that,
Yes.
because a lot of the literature I read,
Yes,
I guess, would be considered modern. I think of it as ancient, but I think it may be modern. So I'm just
Okay.
curious about the time frame.
So let me take a stab at that.
Okay.
It's a recurring theme in the seminar, and part of the reason is that saying, well, there's the ancient epoch and then the medieval and the modern sure sounds systematic, and if it's systematic, we expect logic and math to apply. So there should be the law of the excluded middle, which means there should be time for every time period. It should be in one of these epochs and not in another epoch. That's what we expect, right? From just from rationality and how we've been, culturated. But, if we're using the Hegelian ancient perspective, these things aren't categories, they're organisms. They're organisms. The organism is not the thing, not the block, but the organism is the metaphor that the ancients are using. Everything has life. And as such, it has many of the qualities that living things do. It's paying attention to its environment. It's reacting against what it perceives. It's changing itself internally. It's taking new actions. And as a result, one of the things that Christopher Alexander talks about when he talks about a new definition of life is he says, living things interpenetrate each other. Right? We see in the forest, we think, well, there's one tree and there's two trees and there's three trees and here is a fungus. But what we discover is there are these networks of roots and fungal hyphae where the fungal hyphae actually go into the roots. And now the fungus is trading minerals to the tree, which is trading glucose back to the fungi. And where's the line between the fungus and the tree? And the answer is they interpenetrate each other. And in fact, in most of the 20th century, up until very recently, forest managers saw fungi as parasites. And they thought that the trees would grow better if they applied massive amounts of fungicides to their tree farms and tried to destroy all the fungi. And instead, what happened is that the trees didn't flourish very well. And they're like, well, this is weird. Let's dump some other fertilizers or other things. There must be some external thing we have to do. But they were so determined to apply the law of the excluded middle, to separate every organism into being itself and not anything else, that they broke up the actual interpenetration that's necessary for a forest to function correctly. So taking this through Hegel's approach to history and applying it to these epochs, we expect to find that instead of a nice clean boundary between the epochs, we have interpenetration, right? There are ways in which a great deal of modernity is medievalism. If you look at the structure of most corporations, they're medieval. There is a lord or there is a nobility and they rule over the serfs. And the main upgrade from medievalism in this regard is that the serfs aren't guaranteed a home anywhere. In the medieval period, you couldn't kick a serf off his land, but now you don't have to give your wage serfs any land. You can kick them out whenever you want to. So they're always just like there's a gun to their head. If you want healthcare, if you want a home, if you want food, if you want anything, you better keep pleasing me every single day. And this is what's leading to the rapid acceleration in productivity. And it's also leading to the massive increase in stress because we never have downtime. And stress evolved in us to be an interesting interjection into a life that's normally not stressful. right? Traditional life growing up for Homo sapiens is habitual. You learn where the berries are, you learn where the water is, you go about your life, and then, oh my God, it's a tiger. And stress comes in, your adrenaline comes in and it hyperactivates you. And then when the tiger's been dealt with, you can go, and relax. And this is the life of Homo sapiens right up until modernity, where we've got this kind of medieval relationship, except turned up to 11 in terms of the stress. But you can see the relationship. If you look at how governments are organized in modernity, and you compare that to how corporations are organized, what you see is that the vast majority of people in a corporation have no say. And that's different, at least theoretically, from how a modernist government works. So it's supposed to be either direct democracy or representative democracy, or in any case, some other form that ensures that everybody's needs get met. But that's not the case inside of a corporation. Inside of a corporation, nobody's needs are supposed to be met except for the shareholders or the owners. They're the people whose needs need to get met. And everything else is just an indirect contribution to that. So you see it in this way. You see it in the way that modernist religion retains an enormous amount of medieval theology. And it has booted out a few critical things, such as, like Nietzsche pointed out, we killed God. So now God is an accoutrement or a lifestyle choice or an aesthetic, rather than being the source of all meaning to which our entire society should submit. Right? When modernist societies try to put God in charge to the level that the medievals did, we call it, theocracy. It stands out as being really weird and different from most modern governments. Even governments that have a state religion, most of them, clearly the organization of the state is not subject to their conception of God to the extent that was expected and normal under medievalism. So, where's the line between modernity and medievalism? The answer is, well, we're still medievals in a sense. We're the children of medievals. We like a child bears many of the attributes of its parents, not just genetically but culturally. So do we. We're neo-medievals. Although we hate to think of ourselves that way, because we pride ourselves on we're out of the dark age. We're in the Enlightenment age now. We're all brilliant and smart and objective. The same is true if we look at the line between the ancients and the medievals. And any other epochs that happened before that, any epochs that'll come after this, will find the same thing. And so we talk about the way that an epoch has this rise and fall. You can think of it as thirds, even though it's not divided into equal thirds. There's an early third in which the vast majority of the philosophical foundation of the new epoch is the traditions of the old epoch, which have been taken for granted. And only a few things have been overturned. Whatever the basis of the revolution was, those things have been overturned. But literally everything else came along for the ride as the freight that helps to fill out and make the new epoch make sense. So for the first few centuries, modernity was conspicuously medieval, despite a few things that stood out as, wow, okay, that's different. By the time you get to the middle stage, the great success of the new epoch leads to it purging itself of what it sees as obsolete institutions and traditions. That is to say, in its newfound confidence in the middle third of its rise to power, it starts consciously trying to eliminate all vestiges of the old order. And you see this in Kant, when Kant's talking about, the critique of pure reason and how should reason happen. He is insisting that we should not be relying on tradition and emotion to guide our thinking, that the reason should stand on its own 2 feet in its own terms, and it should make sense, which is why it caused, what Kenneth Smith calls the Kant crisis all over Europe, as people who thought of themselves as smart, but still had an enormous amount of tradition, confronted Kant and couldn't refute his argument, and then started thinking, well, crap, now I have to go through my whole life and all my belief systems and either justify things rationally or purge them. And this is going to be really uncomfortable for me. Same thing was happening to the institutions of modern institutions. The governments were changing. You were getting revolutions happening all over where they're finally kicking out monarchs, sort of belated revolutions, if you will, or they were subjecting their monarchs to constitutional limits to place the monarch under the modern government structures. And then it's not until you get to the late stage of an epoch, after an enormous amount of the previous epoch has been purged, that you start to get enough self-awareness because things begin to break down and fail. You start to develop questioning and self-awareness about, well, what is modernism anyway? The early moderns don't really understand what modernism is. They know the handful of things that they were fighting with medievals about, but they don't see how the rest of it works. But by the late stage, we can start to see, as medievalisms were removed from modernism during the golden age of modernity, what problems came about as a result, like the fact that no one has a home anymore. It's like your home is provisional. It can be taken away from you at any moment. And this is new in history. It's not that people didn't do that, it's that it wasn't the norm before, and it's the norm now. And we didn't know that was a critical part of modernity until modernity was starting to unravel. So where would I put the lines? Where would Kenneth put the lines? Well, Kenneth cites Pico della Mirandola as one of the key breaking points, because Pico, in trying to fix medieval theology, broke it to such an extent that he was put to death for blasphemy and for disrupting the political status quo, which was based in part on the religious status quo and the divine right of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see it as well in the Reformation, when there is this big break that says we are no longer going to try to make one church that will represent God to us and that we will all accept as faithfully describing what God wants. We don't believe that anymore, right? The whole church schisms, and people start seeking personal relationships with God, or they start wanting to have hierarchies that are different from the hierarchy that they had in the Middle Ages. But at any rate, the old deal is gone. It's not going to work anymore. And that break is in particular important because religion was so important to the definition of the medieval epoch, that to drive a wedge right down the center of that is really to split off from the medieval epoch. There's two others. There are a number of rebellions that are less clearly taught in modern history, that have to do with taxation and trade revolts. Freedom of the market from being parasitized by a noble class is a critical part of the break from medievalism, because the economic structures were basically ensuring that if traders, generated any money or wanted to do any deals, the Lord took his piece, and there was no guarantee about what that would be used for. It could be used for anything. So modern taxation has changed so that there are laws to say what's going to happen through taxation, and that say when can you and when can you not intervene to pull off part of the profits. This change is one that Marx wrote a great deal about. He was obsessed with the economic side of the break. And I would say the other critical break would have to be scientific, right? Are we allowed to say things that are not approved by the church? Are we allowed to generate hypotheses that fly in the face of dogma? And you can study the history of Bruno went to the stake. Galileo, got his ass handed to him. You can look at the history of this and see where are the periods when the church really maintains a stranglehold over what's allowed to be said scientifically, and where's the break when scientists start saying, I don't care. I think this is, my studies suggest that this is the truth, and I'm just going to say it because I don't think you can put me to death anymore. I don't think you can put me under house arrest. You see that transition happening. And part of the way that it happens is that the societies that follow that lead are able to become rapidly more technologically advanced than the ones that insist that the church remain in charge of scientific truth. And so there is what we might call I hate to use the word, but a meritocracy style revolution, in which nobody has to, although they did, nobody has to point a gun at anybody else to make it happen. It's just simply some people are falling behind because they're sticking to the old ways, and other people are advancing because they're embracing the new ways. So if you study the history of science, if you study the history of the Reformation, if you study the revolutions, like the 1848 revolution is a late one, a late series of revolutions. And if you study all of these things, you'll find they've all got different dates that people pick for them. And that makes sense, right? If you watch the way that an amoeba moves, which pseudopods behind it let go in what order. It's sort of non-deterministic, and they don't all let go at once. It's, you know, the one that's the furthest back lets go next because it's under the most pressure. But as a range of dates, you can say that by the 1400s and 1500s, the writing's on the wall. By the 1600s, it's obvious. So you can look at, for example, 1492. When do we start raiding North and South America for resources and to engage in industrialized slavery at a level that the world has never seen before? That is one of the key points. And if you study the history of industrialized slavery, you discover, and I didn't know this until just a few years ago, you discover that Europe already had started that with Africa a century before. Or in the century before, starting with Portugal and then Spain, they started raiding Africa and using that to generate a kind of a burst of wealth by parasitizing a whole other continent. And then the power that came from doing that and the scientific advances they were able to use to extend into continents they'd never found before, the age of discovery, and it became a feedback loop. So I kind of tend to date it to when Portugal said, ooh, Africa. It lines up pretty well with when, you know, when do you get Galileo and Bruno? When do you get Pico della Mirandola? When do you get the Reformation? It's a period of about 200 years from the first clear inklings to the, okay, at this point, there's been a break. The Reformation, almost everybody says, at this point, there's clearly been a break, but you got to date it earlier than that. So I know that's a long, complicated answer to a short, very important question, but
a good answer though. Thank you so much. Yeah,
sure. And if I had specialists on this call in each of these areas, they could all give you their favorite dates, and you discover that none of them line up because, you know, when did the religious break happen? When did the economic break happen? When the political? When the scientific? They're all at different points, but they're affecting each other. It's the interesting thing about these transitional periods. If you study them in detail, you discover that it's not just a random collection of breaks. The first break helps set in motion the second break, and so on. There is a momentum that's building, to use physics terms, or to use Heraclitean, more biological terms. There are feedback loops. Old feedback loops are being broken and new feedback loops are being created. And so the focus of the organism of history, of human culture, is shifting its attention. Phil, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, you talk about when modernity began, got me to thinking, actually something I've said before, a couple of things actually. The relationship between Nature 1 and Nature 2, and Nature 1 being much more, I'll say, mechanical. In other words, carbon will be carbon and so forth, you know, and Nature 2 being much more organic. In other words, it's independent trading relationship between many things that are related. And in some sense, you know, I think that has something to do with the Greek ideal as well, because the relationship of the self at that time retained a lot of relationship with others, not so much with nature, although it did relate with nature, but certainly with the community. So the self was not wrapped up in like, well, there's me and then there's everybody else. You know, I have to survive, I have to pay my rent and all that kind of stuff, whatever they do, you know, and so I'm looking out for myself. But there was also a relationship with the community. And I mentioned that, you know, like with Socrates, he was given a choice there in his penalty, whether he wanted to have the sentence of death or just be exiled. And being exiled to the Greeks was so abhorrent. In some ways, it was worse than that, because you cut off, in a sense, you cut off an essential part of yourself, your relationship with others. And so, even though the other at least by majority, didn't want you around anymore. Still, you have a relationship with it. We kind of don't have that as much. We have some of that. I don't mean that we don't retain some relationship with the community, but we are much more about ourselves, and we see ourselves at best as related to the community, but it's still us relating to the community. And so that identity, and I'm thinking back, like in some way that actually began with the Greeks, because, because the self, they held up certain people like Achilles and, Hector and so forth as individuals that stood out in the community. So, Odysseus as paradigms that you could model. So in some sense, that relationship of the individuality was already beginning, certainly at the writing of Homer, if not earlier than that, but certainly by that time. So all these things develop in a kind of slow creep, until it got to a point where it was. Now, the second point about the relationship of eco 1 and eco 2 is that at some point, I think probably with Hegel in a way, is that he recognized that the community has developed this zeitgeist that actually is about interpenetration, a relationship between the geist and the zeitgeist, and that in some sense that has created a sort of a metaphorical relationship with nature as being interdependent, integrated with each other, because we certainly live in a situation where even though we are ourselves separate from others by most degree, we also know that we are interdependent, but we depend on, like the products being produced. We depend on there being a supermarket. I guess we could be independent. We just get a cabin in Montana and try to hunt and do whatever it is. But most of us don't. We are so dependent on others that in some sense, and there's a kind of a funny paradox. And I blame myself for that, because I myself kind of operate that way. Is like the funny paradox is, in so much as we depend on others, or at least at the mechanisms of society, we are nonetheless distanced from it at the same time. So that we had, in a sense, cut off our nose to spite ourselves, and we can't do that. I mean, so there's a very, very funny paradox, that we have to figure out as to what degree we are actually entangled with otherness, and what degree that we should remain sort of distant as well. I'm sure that a tree and the fungus, the tree knows it's a tree, and the fungus knows it's fungus. The entangle in a relationship. And I was thinking, as you said that, we end up killing the fungus, and it was not good for the tree. But when you think about it, when you think about ecological relationship about the self and others, it's always a proportional relationship, because we know that certain poisons that will kill you in the right amount actually helps you, right? In the right places. So it's a proportional relationship. It's not, once again, it's related to sublation in a way, not too much, but just a little. And what is the proportional relationship? Yeah, I'm sure killing some of the fungus did help the tree, but to what degree? It's like, so I think that's what we have to come to realize, that this gray relationship, we have to evaluate always the proportional relationship that we have with otherness, and to what degree it relate to ourselves. And I think too often we draw a hard line, like, this is mine and that's yours, forget it, and I think that's not that's not the right relationship. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that's all right on the money. We've got, these are complex issues. We keep looking for simple answers as moderns. One of the ways in which that simplicity happens is that over the centuries, modernity is trying to unplug us from each other and from every concrete, natural thing that we need, and to instead plug us into the economy and say the economy will meet all of our needs. So we don't need each other, and we don't need that river or that tree or this garden that you don't need any of those things. The market will provide. And part of the logic of this consists of turning concrete, tangible, specific things into interchangeable resources, abstract interchangeable resources. So instead of a team working on a problem made up of specific people who each have their strengths and weaknesses, we turn people into human resources, units of production and expertise, and we swap them in and out. And you see managers doing this in large corporations all the time because they don't know the actual people or what they're good at or not good at. They don't know how to put a team together of specific people. So they start talking about people in abstracto as we need, a software engineer and a tester but no two software engineers are the same. No two testers are the same. Everybody's got their own things that they're good at. And by trying to make everything be abstract and interchangeable, modernity is losing its grip on things. It's weird. For example, if you look at the history of metalworking, it's weird how on the one hand, we can produce substances nobody could ever produce before, yay, science, progress. But on the other hand, if you look at the quality of specific things, objects that have been created, we have a lot of bland, generic objects that are not very good at what they do. And if you look back in history, you can find that pretty quickly after the invention of copperworking, people were making some of the finest copper objects that have ever been created in the history of the world. They were in no rush. The market didn't tell them, by God, you have to get this thing, released tomorrow or you're going to lose your home the way that modernity does. So, if someone wanted to spend forever working on copper, on a copper kettle and making it the greatest copper kettle that had ever been created, and if they could convince their family and neighbors to, feed them and take care of them while they did that, then they would create the greatest copper kettle ever made, even though they were primitive and backwards and so on. There's a way in which when people are allowed to interact with specific, concrete, tangible reality, they can achieve things that can't be achieved when we are compelled only to interact with abstract, theoretical, systematic reality.
Rick, let me interrupt you because I do want to interject this point. The contemporary culture, that's too generalized, but nonetheless, I'll say it, has sublated us in a sense that we actually are brainwashed. We actually like it. We actually like it, like these things. I'll just use a simple example, and I'm sure not everybody will agree. We like going to what is a Yellowstone because there's a comfortable coffee house, there's hotels, all these things. And we could sip, the coffee and enjoy the croissants and that, and since Old Faithful is so faithful, when it's time, we'll go down to, look at the spectacle, and then we'll go back and have the comfort. I mean, that is actually a heck of a lot better than having to hike there, camp out, and all that is like, yeah, but we like this creature comfort.
We do.
And so we have been sublated to the degree that we actually are what they project that we want. And so there's a circular relationship that's become a problem. And I think it's just as difficult for us to unsublate ourselves.
Yeah.
As they say, what is our authentic self? Because all this stuff, we have been so sublated that we are what they want us to be, and we like it. we can't do without these things. So I think there's a incredible irony in all that.
Yeah, there is. It's part of why I love Monty Python and a Life of Brian. The scene when he woke up in the morning and opened the blinds and there's a whole crowd out there trying to adore him, and Brian is going, "You don't have to follow me. You don't have to follow anyone. You're all individuals." And they all say as one, "Yes, we're all individuals." And the one cranky guy in the back says, "I'm not." And his neighbor says, "Shh." Just something about that scene really speaks to modernity and the way in which we are all sure that we're all special snowflakes who are completely individual and in complete control of who we are. And yet, when you take our vital statistics, even the ways that we rebel against modernity are modern rebellions. We really are using the tools that have been given to us to try to understand, even to understand what an alternative to modernity might be like. It's if that weren't so, modernity wouldn't have lasted this long, right? And what makes an epoch powerful is that its explanations of the world seem to circle you back to its own position. So even when you're trying to get away from it, you end up back in it. You know, when Lenin did the revolution when he took over the revolution in Russia, do you think it was his plan to create a capitalist Russia in the 21st century? Was that why people, bled and died? Their goal was to reiterate capitalism again, just without czars this time. You got to think you could hook up magnets to Lenin's grave and power the whole world from the speed at which he's spinning in there. The irony that after all that work, what we have is capitalism in Russia. It's crazed, right? But he was rebelling using the tools for understanding the world that were available to him. Even Marx, who he was drawing off of, was rebelling against modernity using the analytical tools. He was using Hegel, right? He was using Kant. He was using the tools available to him. And so his attempt to describe what would come after capitalism, by which we mean the economic part of modernity, or one of the economic options of modernity, perhaps we should say, ends up reading weirdly. I mean, you read the manifesto, it's weirdly by rote. It's got this weird systematic quality to it, and it's sort of vague about what's going to come next. But, everybody who's tried to follow that recipe has ended up back in modernity. Even before Russia became capitalist, even when it was communist, the absolute opposite of capitalist, when we evaluate it not in strictly Marxist terms, but in these broader Hegelian, Kenneth Smithian, Hannah Arendtian terms, we discover that it's modern, right? That there would be plans, regardless of whether it's created by a dictator or a committee or a democracy, the idea that we would plan in advance what's going to happen for the next 5 years in detail and rewire all of our factories to do that. And then what do we discover 5 years from now? We discover that we're so busy being noetic and having a logos approach to the world. We're so busy planning and thinking and rationalizing that we haven't listened to the world. We haven't paid attention to whether our water is clean or whether our soil is clean or whether people actually need something else. We marched, we being the Soviet Union in this case, are marching according to the script that we laid for ourselves. This is not actually all that different from capitalism, in which the script is determined by CEOs of corporations instead of by the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in both cases, what we find is a lack of gnosis, a lack of semathesy, and we find a huge reliance on recipes and logic and rationality to lay out how the world is going to be. And then, well, we discovered that we are not gods of the world. The world is going to emerge the way it's going to emerge. And if we knew what was good for us, we would put a lot of effort into listening and watching and, being quick to adjust to whatever it is that's emerging, rather than for 5 years, heads down, blinkers on, trying to slam out the plan from the past that we all agreed on. That insistence on systematized mechanical approaches to the world in which we don't pay attention and we try to make our vision come true. This is what Hannah Arendt really skewers in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Says, if you want to make Stalin and Hitler spin in their grave, all you have to do is say that their respective approaches to their respective ideologies were strikingly similar, because they hated each other and they thought they were the opposites of each other, but they were both ultra rationalists. They were both following as she puts it in The Origins of Totalitarianism, they were both rigorously applying the logic of their ideology and suppressing any evidence that the ideology was not an accurate description of the world. And if that meant that you had to have concentration camps, if that meant that you had to have gulags, whatever it meant, you had to erase the evidence of your errors in your ideology. And, you know, constantly ballyhoo how great your ideology is and how accurately it describes the world. They both did it. They just had different recipes that they were insisting on. Hi, Zelig, welcome. Stephen, go ahead, and then Donald. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, I was just going to say about the slavery, it's a bit risky to be emotive. Like the Portuguese raided Africa for slaves. As far as I know, they generally just bought them at the slave markets. There were sophisticated cultures along the African coast. I was told by one researcher that the real masters of chattel slavery in the Middle Ages had been the Arabs. They were the ones that had kept the art alive. Well, it existed in Rome and it existed in Greece, but Dark Ages Europe, chattel slavery had declined because the impression I get, it takes a lot of smarts to run industrial slavery. It's like running a company. Unless you really know what you're doing, you're not going to do it terribly well. And yeah, I watched the old show Roots when I was a kid. And, you know, it has this wonderful scene, you know, the white slavers jump off their ship and go into the jungle, and I doubt anything like that happens very much. It might have happened on a small scale, but it's a lot easier to go to the slave market where they've already trained them in the arts a bit of obeying.
Yeah.
But you need, this is the thing, you need often very hard and nasty people to run large numbers of slaves on the industrial scale. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Spanish and Portuguese had gained this very quickly by hiring Arabs who were very, and Moors and that, who were very expert in how you did it. There's a big question there, but this sort of simple view that they just ran down there and dragged people in, it's not that easy.
No, it's not that easy.
Even the chattel slave has to know what they're doing, what their role is, what they can do and what they can't do. And it's a vast industrial system. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I didn't take the time on that I should have. The thing that happens in modernity that's new is not slavery. That goes all the way back to the ancient period and maybe to previous epochs, right? We're just not clear on where the lines are in those previous epochs. But it certainly goes back to the ancient world. I mean, the Romans were masters of it. And as you say, throughout Africa, the Muslims were the masters of most of the slave routes throughout Africa. And there were other slave routes that were even older than that had been run by Africans themselves. Some kingdoms were slaving kingdoms and other kingdoms were not, and they fought about these things. The thing that happens that's new is the way that we begin to industrialize slavery. Slavery before that had to be, it's like the difference between manufacturing and industry, right? You can be a medieval person, and if you can get enough of you in a room, weaving wool and cloth, you can have a manufacturing industry. This was one of England's claims to fame. It's, that they were smart about organizing large numbers of people into weaving and growing sheep, shearing them, weaving, weaving the cloth that came out of it, dyeing the cloth, and then setting up the trade routes. They had all of that long before industrialization, but there was it wasn't systematized into machinery, and it wasn't systematized into the sense that we are going to restructure our entire nation to specialize in this thing. It was always, that's part of what we do. Part of what distinguishes industry in the medieval era from in the modern era is that in the medieval era, there were a lot of things that people were doing, and industry was part of it. And it's why it was never made as efficient as possible. It was competing for attention. But when Portugal and Spain decided that this was going to be their ticket to rise to power in Europe, they did a number of things, and one of which was they wanted to become masters at this. They wanted to outcompete the Muslims in this area, for one thing. They wanted to take over the trade routes, for another, over time. And of course, that meant that they also wanted to reorganize their religion to bless this in a way that it hadn't been blessed before. They wanted to say, God wants us to do this. They wanted to organize their military to specialize in conquering places that they thought would give them more control over the slave routes than they had before. They sort of, this is part of the trick of modernity, is you get to where, instead of being a whole organism that's having to attend to lots of different competing needs, you start to specialize and try to make yourself an efficient machine. And you can see that in the way.
I might add that it's the old Sid Meier game, colonization.
Yes. And what you can see in this is the way that Portugal and then Spain leapt out ahead economically of the rest of Europe. And the rest of Europe was rocked back on their heels and said, what is happening now? And realized that they all had to follow suit. It's one of the qualities of modernity is that it's so effective in the short term that it becomes addictive. It becomes one of these meritocracies. Either you follow the lead or you fall behind. Those are your only choices. And so all of the major European countries felt like they had to follow suit. And the early history shows that Portugal went first. And we've got documentation of the Spanish rulers realizing that Portugal was rising to power above them. Small Portugal, their neighbor, was getting more powerful than all of Spain. And that's what incited Spain to get into the trade and to try to industrialize it. They're like, this is unacceptable. We can't let them do that to us. And then once the Iberian Peninsula had done that, the rest of Europe, France and England and Germany and the Netherlands, they all started following suit, because they had the same epiphany that Spain had earlier, which is you do this or you fall behind to become a backwater. So it's that accelerating curve. It's like, for instance, there was this film, The Last Samurai, some years back, which has the typical structure of, okay, samurais are cool and all, but our hero is a white guy who becomes the best samurai because he's white people do things better. But there's underneath that kind of racist surface, there's really interesting things that they're talking about. They allow plenty of time to explore the perspective of the Japanese themselves. And one of the critical issues that's I think really highlighted in that film is that to be a great swordsman required a lifetime of training and focus. But you could hand any idiot a gun, and in a few weeks, you could have them mowing down people who'd spent their whole lives becoming good at the sword. There is this way in which, when you hit a technological revolution, it becomes a historical trap. You either go forward or you fail. You can't stay where you are. You have been radically destabilized. Your old way of life is completely over. You either move on or you get conquered. And those are your two choices. So, the Moors had been running slave routes through Africa for 1,000 years. Well, I think at that point it was more like 800 years, and Africa was still intact. It wasn't good. I mean, I don't want to in any way paint a picture of Muslim slavery, enslaving of Africans as having been a good thing for 800 years, but many independent African countries still existed, but and had a lot of power and influence. But once Europe discovered and decided to take over the slave trade, their industrialized approach using the evolution of gunpowder and so on, it became a system of rapid feedback loops that so accelerated the power of Europe and its appetite that Africa got trashed. I mean, you see kingdom after kingdom after kingdom collapsed in just a very short order. The next 100 years was just appalling for the course of African history. And the same thing happens when they have secured Africa and their explorations discover the Americas. The pace of change in the Americas is incredibly fast, and it follows the same model that had already been established in Africa. So this is the thing I want to emphasize, Stephen, is on the one hand, you're absolutely right. This builds off the past. There's no way in which there's a line and we say, the thing before this is completely different from the thing after this. This is organic growth. But what makes it an inflection point in history is the way that it becomes a rapid accelerator that forces permanent change of a kind never seen before. That's how it's one of the ways that you measure if you're shifting out of one epoch and into another. It's not just big change. It's not just like Athens and Sparta going to war. It's like Alexander the Great conquering Greece, and now there is no more. There is no more Greece. Or even bigger than that, it's like Christianity rising within the Roman Empire, and now there's only one God, and all the old gods are gone. All of them. All the temples are put down everywhere that these people can go. You're talking about a radical change such that the patterns of history never go back. They can't go back because of the amount of force and energy in the new structures. So, but thanks for bringing that up, because I really did short shrift. Any legit history of slavery in Africa brings up what you're talking about. There's a long history there. Geneva in the comments earlier asked, is it possible, based on what you've said today, that we're moving into a period that is what will come after the moderns? Well, our challenge is, in any time you're in the last third of an epoch, we know from hindsight that whatever is going to come next is all around us, right? If we look at the late stage Roman Empire, right before Constantine, you can see the ferment that's leading to the rise of Christianity and medievalism. And it's the same if you look before the Reformation. Even if we, as moderns so often do, suppress discussions of slavery, if we just look at issues of religion before the Reformation, what we see is the last 2 centuries before the Reformation is a growing level of corruption within the church that's at a level that previously would never have been tolerated. I mean, open buying and selling of indulgences, popes having children, and getting involved in overthrowing kings who don't support the right policies. I mean, there's a lot of fingers in the pie that break down all the basis for the medieval epoch. And what you're seeing at that point are counter movements. Long before the Reformation, you're seeing counter movements of people going, this isn't okay. This can't keep going like this. This has to stop. Many of the discussions that later became, foregrounded after the Reformation were already happening in the centuries leading up to it. And you can see the same thing at the economic level. You can see in the tax revolts. You can see in the revolts about free trade versus encumbered trade. You can see capitalism not in its full rich form like we would recognize it today or from the 20th century, but you can see it pushing. You can see trade magnates and bankers and all these pieces of what are going to become the major institutions of modernity. They're growing in power and prominence. They just are still subject to something that they don't want to be subject to. And it's when they throw off the shackles and become the new dominant that we've crossed over. So for us, the difficulty is, sure, all around us, whatever's going to come next has already emerged and is growing. Our problem is that as moderns, we can't distinguish it. We haven't left modernity behind, so we're taking for granted enormous numbers of things that after the revolution, not to use a Marxist term, but after the change of epochs, anybody in the later epoch would look back and say, well, yeah, that was good. That wasn't going to happen anymore. That was going to be gone. But we don't know that. So we have trouble figuring out which is which. And the other thing that makes it difficult is that a certain amount of what's going on, like I mentioned earlier, is still medievalisms that persist into the modern epoch. And some of those we think we might mistake those as well for maybe that's going to be the future. So we're the fish who swim in the water who don't know that there's such a thing as water. It's really, we can't untangle the pieces from each other. And this is where sort of the idealism of the Marxist model of revolutions becomes apparent, because the way he describes revolution makes it seem as though revolutionaries always know what needs to be overthrown and what needs to be preserved. But the history of 20th century revolution suggests quite the opposite, that we are the people who are doing revolutions, especially the ones who are trying to accelerate history on purpose by pushing it. They're doing it based on their own ideologies and not based on what's actually true, because we don't know what's actually true. That's the human condition, right? We're struggling to look through these lens systems and try to work out what's true and what's not, and what's important and what's not. And we really are just bewildered, to try to sort out which is which.
And we don't want to end up like Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice either, where we start a process we can't stop.
Yes. In fact, we can be sure whatever we start will be some process we can't start, full of unintended consequences. I think sometimes about the Western canon. It's a long argument Harold Bloom had about, there should be some things that we all read in common so we can have conversations and understand each other. And the question is, well, what should those things be that we have in common? And, for us, I would like to see a canon that involved a lot more philosophical sophistication, and when you think about that, you think, well, one thing you have to teach everybody is the law of unintended consequences. And can you do much better than the Sorcerer's Apprentice? I mean, it's a really exceptionally good example of, he just wanted to do this one thing. Look at all these consequences. Anyway, thanks for bringing it up. Donald, and then Zelig, and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I wanted to talk about what Geneva said. But it may be superfluous, although what I was going to say is quite different from what you said.
Yeah, please.
Because there was a big effort, I would say, within modernity to try and recover the ancients as ancients. This is what we find in Nietzsche, Murray, Dobbs, Finley, Arendt. There's some others. That was just some that came, and really undo, in some ways, the medieval understanding of the ancients, which I find pretty pernicious, where Plato's idea of the good and Aristotle's unmoved mover became the Christian God, which, if you wanted to have Plato and Aristotle spinning in their graves, I think that would just about do it. But it's clear, and from what you said, sort of about markets, exchange, economics, it seems to me we could go back to that thing on, what was it? Nature as intrinsic truth, that there are archae. We've discussed here. We're not good at saying this is an archae, because that sort of, the archae are kind of meta truths that are above the system, that it's very hard to get at from in any, just from life. That'd be our system, I guess. But that but it does seem to be that human nature points to, we've always been in groups. We've always depended upon some kind of exchange, some kind of specialization of one kind or another. And they're archaic, they're sort of, maybe they're kind of economic archaic that in the end undo capitalism and communism equally, because they fail to adhere in fundamental ways to the real archy that drive economic activity. And so to kind of say what this says about what Geneva asked, are we at the end? Well, there have been movements. I think this is a move. I think this attempt to recover the ancients, of which Kenneth Smith is probably the last of that line, unless you and David really get moving, is that, I mean, when I studied philosophy, that was a big deal to this recovery of the ancients on their own terms, because modern philosophy was really weird. It was, logical positivism. It was coming up with all these symbol systems that led nowhere. But I can't say that this movement has been successful, that if you go look at modern philosophy, you find out that, oh, wow, yeah, everybody's gone back to some earlier state. I should say Hegel. That's a big one, who just modernity, like, tried to wake up and concluded it like sleeping better. I don't know that, but that movement in modern philosophy, I don't think continued strongly. And so I would say to Geneva, maybe we don't really know where we're gonna end up. Does what we're saying get us that we're moving to a period after the moderns? I think within modernity, people try to do that. Some people, Kenneth tries to do that, and he looks back and he sees Arendt, and he's always saying, go read Finley, go read Dodge, go read Murray, go read Hegel, go read Nietzsche. These are a collective group of people that tried to somewhat escape modernity, not by what's going to come after modernity, but by recovering the ancient, to what Kenneth's program of acquiring perspectives that allow us to judge. And did that work? Geneva, I'm afraid we're just in love with ourselves, just as we are, as we've always been. And I wish I had something hopeful to say. I thought I might, but when I reviewed what I knew about the situation, no. But this is a nice little group. We are trying to overcome modernity. One amateur philosopher at a time. At least in this group, something you seldom hear in philosophical discussion is people trying to live philosophical lives, which is not typically a modern perspective. That's not what it would be like. Know the answers on the history of philosophy test. It'd be more like modern philosophy, or how valid is A's critique of B, or something like that. It wouldn't be, gee, you ought not to be sitting in this classroom. You ought to be going out and finding out how you should behave to be a better person and how your actions affect other people and the things that as human beings we might collectively be responsible for, since we're all part of this phusis that evolved everything or gave rise to everything, all interconnected. Well, sorry, you woke me up, Geneva, and then I had to dump a downer, I guess.
So, I got to respond before we go on. And my response is going to be, I don't disagree with anything Donald said per se. But what I would say is that it is very difficult to know whether what you're doing is helping to make the future better or worse or having no effect at all, because history moves at a different pace than human lives. And it's easier to see with Noetic philosophies, because a Noetic philosophy is a catechism. It's as an ideology, it's got a set of rules and how you reason and what are the thought turning cliches you're supposed to arrive at. And as a result, you can tell if somebody's doing it because they're using the terms, and every time you get into discussion with them, you always end up at the conclusion that they want you to be at. This is what it means to be a Noetic philosopher. So it's easier to measure whether a Noetic philosophy is spreading because people are waving the symbols around. That they've got their flags and their holy symbols and what have you. A Gnostic philosophy, and Kenneth Smith would be the first to say he's definitely pushing on the Gnostic side as a counter movement against hyper-Noetic philosophy. The way that what happens if you immerse yourself in a more Gnostic philosophy is that you resort less often to dogma and catechism and thought-turning cliches. You have fewer symbols to wave around. You have been taught to spend less time insisting that the world is this way, and instead you're taught to listen more and watch more and try to pay attention and try to be more sensitive to what's really going on, and to let what's really going on shape your choices instead of letting an ideology shape your choices. It is because it's the inversion. The result is it can be very hard to tell when people are behaving in a more Gnostic fashion than they were previously, because instead of a great noise coming out with certain stereotypical symbols, you get a quiet descending as people listen more, and you get less stereotypical responses, because the whole point of Gnosis is to get responses that are more appropriate to the specific conditions, and the conditions are different everywhere, right? So maybe one person gets more into gardening and the next person writes a children's book, and somebody else, it's hard to characterize what are the right things to do other than to say that they are concrete and specific to different people's situations, which means instead of manifesting as a great shared noise, they manifest in a lot of different ways that might be difficult to recognize as being part of the same movement. In modernity, the whole idea of a movement is a Noetic movement. We don't even really have language to express what a Gnostic movement would be like. It almost sounds like an anti-movement, except that mere contrarianism, rebel without a cause kind of stuff is also Noetic. And this wouldn't be that either. It wouldn't just be about breaking laws or breaking traditions. It would be about doing different things in different circumstances. So the first caveat I would add to what Donald said, which I don't think contradicts it in any way, is that if Kenneth's attempt to change the world were having an influence, it would be extremely difficult to tell. The second caveat I'll add is what we said before. We're the fishies in the water. This is our water. And as a result, the least qualified people in the world to say, is us. It's like, this is invisible to us, right? What we're swimming in. And it makes it very hard for us to figure out what has changed to get us here and what is going to change next to take us out of here. Wherever it is we're going is not apparent from our perspective. Ask people 300 years from now, and they'll have an easier time, maybe, figuring it out. Again, none of this is, when people come to philosophy and say, I want answers, they're always going to be frustrated with Kenneth, who's going to give them questions and perspectives. Because the perspective doesn't give them answers. It just gives them a way to find their own answers out in the world. It sounds like a lot of work, right? The other thing that I would add before I call on Zelig and Phil is that we don't know what the next epoch will look like. We don't know what its strengths and weaknesses are. We don't know what should be kept and what should be changed. To know that, we would have to have already gone through the process that our descendants are going to go through. As a result, we don't know what we should be doing right now. We don't know what the right steps are to get to where we're going, because we don't know where we're going or how it, and because we don't know where we're going, we don't know how to compare it to what we have. And every attempt that I've seen to date to specify the optimal place for us to be going next is some kind of Noetic caricature. So the only thing I can say for sure is, well, we certainly shouldn't go there. It's another ideology, right? We should not, the solution to noesis is not to embrace noesis and dive into the next ideology. So as a result, we could, I'm not asserting that we are, right? I don't think we are. I don't claim to know what the right thing is to do. We could even at this moment be doing precisely the right, perfect thing. We could be generating a gnosis movement that is in the process of spreading across the world and changing everything for the better. And we still wouldn't know it. This is my third point, that because we don't know where we're going, nor how to get there, we don't even know if what we're doing is, not only don't we know if it's the right thing, we don't even know if it's the wrong thing. It could be the right thing. It could be having the proper effect, and we wouldn't be able to tell. None of this satisfies our ultra-rationalist Apollinian Noetic drive to stand like gods of reason and gaze down upon the earth and pronounce judgments on true and false, according to the law of the excluded middle, which is what we've been catechized to do. So it's not satisfying at an ideological level. It doesn't feel nutritious to us, ideologically nutritious to us, to give answers like this. But I suspect that this is actually nutritious for us, to learn to put down the bottle, if you will, the ideological, get that next swig of ideology, to put that bottle down and say, it's okay not to know where we're going. It's okay not to know if we're doing the right thing. We just want to, what we ought to be doing right now is learning how to put the bottle down and how to pay attention to the nature around us and within us, so that we can learn to behave in less stereotypical ideological ways and to behave in ways that are more sympathetic. I'm going to extend Nora Bateson's term. That is, that are in better harmony to what's actually happening and what's actually healthy. The less we prescribe on the basis of ideology, and the more we pay attention and try to learn from what we're observing, the more we are engaging in a counter-modern activity. And where that leads, I don't think it's not only is it not our job to know, it's not our responsibility to know. There's nothing wrong with not knowing, right? The whole idea of symathesy as the critical principle of all life is that living things don't know the answers in advance, and yet they've been able to evolve all of this wonderful ecosystem that we depend on so much from lifelessness. All of that was done sympathetically. So if it's possible to start from, lava and bare rock and no oxygen atmosphere and create all of this through symathesy, then it should be possible to start with all of this and make things better through symathesy, even though it doesn't satisfy us ideologically. But I don't think anything that I said contradicts what Donald said. I think this is just extending. He can come off mute and tell me if I'm full of it.
No, you're not. We don't know. And that's hard to accept. But you get older, you'll accept it. The list of things you don't know will become so long that you don't worry about it anymore. But yeah, you're right. I look as somewhat for guidance to like what were the Greeks that we read of after the Peloponnesian War. They realized there were two things. Again, what went wrong? How did we do it? But in the 5th century, it was, the good man is the product of a good polis. You need that environment in place to afterwards, how good can we be without that? Now that the good polis has been smashed like a ceramic pot, what's the best we can do on our own? This is a lot of what I think is in Plato and Aristotle. How can we be a good man lacking the good polis? And I would say we don't have a good polis to grow up in today.
Right.
We could argue that. That would get into economics and politics and, a lot of stuff. But maybe this group would be willing to concede my point that things have gone wrong in modernity, but how good a person can you be as living in the modernity?
Right.
And then, okay, well, are you doing that? Well, you should be. Try harder.
Yeah. So, it's the natural, if we look at the transitions from the ancient world to the medieval and from the medieval to the modern, one of the things that we see is a breaking down of all the institutions, include all from the largest down to the smallest, torn apart, and then down to reflection, and then having to put everything back together again, growing back up from the smallest level to the largest. And it's because the new way of seeing the world is incompatible with the old way of seeing the world. And it's because the old way of seeing the world had done its work already to insinuate itself all the way down from the largest to the smallest scale. And so without that process of metamorphosis at every level, you can't move on. You've got friction inside yourself. So it's one of the reasons why, I can look at the world and say, I know we're in late stage modernity. And the way I know is there's open discussion now of it not working. Modernity is not working. And the problems are accumulating and they're becoming intermeshed, where you can't fix one problem without fixing it. Marx said some things right and some things wrong, but one of the best things he said is straight dialectics, which is that one of the ways you know that you're getting to the end of an epoch is when you can't fix anything, because every other part of the system militates against your ability to have any impact. And so you get to a stage where you can't fix anything without fixing everything. He says, a revolution isn't some miraculous, wonderful thing. A revolution is where everything changes, because if it doesn't, nothing can happen. It's all gridlocked. And people have been talking about gridlock in government for a while now, right? This is open discussion about it not working. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, Vietnam, the things that are happening in the US. There's all kinds of things where people are more and more openly saying this just isn't working. That's not a discussion you have in the first 2/3 of an epoch. That's a discussion you have in the late stage of an epoch. So I know that puts us there, but I also see that the dominant institutions of the last 500 years are still in charge. Banks, insurance companies, right? CEOs, all the power structures are still there. We're all still using money, right? Which, by the way, mostly we weren't in the medieval epoch. It was one of the indicators of the fall of Rome was a massive drop in the production of currency and the use of currency. And one of the indicators of the rise of the modern era was a massive increase in the production of currency. So, that hasn't changed. So I think that positions us clearly prior to the change of epochs. We are not in the next epoch yet. I think it would be impossible for us to predict how much further the late stage will go. We don't know enough, but it's an organism, and it's on its way down. Our job is to explore these ideas and try to work out what the alternatives could be. What are better ways to live? Not so that we can make them happen, but because we've got to learn. And this is how we learn. We explore and we try things. Okay, Zelig, and then Phil, and then Ginny. Go ahead, Zelig. Come off mute.
How's it going? Yeah, you guys give a lot of food for thought for sure. I was thinking in the beginning when I jumped in, you guys were talking about how in certain eras you just can't stop the behavior of a people, because that would undermine the whole set. It would literally kill the people group that they're trying to do good to themselves. And it makes me think, as moderns, the way we look at the Bible in terms of when it speaks about not chattel slavery like the one we had in America, where it was basically just like a color thing, but it was based upon indentured servitude, or where people actually were products of wars, right? And they were kept forever. And many moderns, people like Bill Maher, for example, would say, the Bible, it promoted slavery. And it's like, well, yes and no. If you read the text close up, the Jewish or the Israelites were prohibited from enslaving their own brothers, right? Their own kinship forever. They were supposed to let them go free after the Jubilee year, which was after like 7 years. I think 7 years. After 7 years, all debts were to be forgiven, and so they would let their indentured servants or slaves go free. But if they were not Israelites, they were actually bought from the surrounding tribes or peoples, or conquered. They could enslave them forever. And so you're like, okay, what's going on here? Like, they permitted each other to enslave one another as a kind of like a contract, but they wouldn't allow it to happen for non-Israelites, non-Jewish people. And you're like, huh? So that means that there's a recognition there that if you would remove slavery from their societies, they would completely perish. Like their whole economy would just like collapse. And so that kind of makes me think of what you're saying. Like, slavery could not have been removed immediately without destroying that economy at the time. And that makes sense. Like, it reminds me also of like passages in the New Testament where the followers of Jesus, when he tells them a parable that the evil one or the devil, right, goes and sows tares into a field of wheat. And they're like, hey, we should go and uproot these tares. And Jesus says, no, because if you uproot, you don't know which ones is good or evil because they're too young yet. It's immature. So you're going to pull out the good ones and the bad ones together, and you're going to destroy the crop. Wait till they mature so that you know which one is the tare and which one is the good crop. And then you go in there and you take it out. And it's that same principle. There's that moments in time when that society is too immature, that if you would completely remove slavery, or you would completely remove the free market, for example, in our society, if tomorrow they would remove capitalism, we would completely disappear. Like, everything would collapse. It has to be transition. So that comes to my mind as moderns when we look at ancient texts like that and say, hey, how come they just didn't remove it? And it's like, well, what about if they would remove Starbucks tomorrow from you without telling you? I'm pretty sure you have a difficult time going to work without your daily coffee, you know? And then another thing you guys mentioned was this idea of not being able to know what's before us. And I think that's where Heidegger, he was right. I think we kind of are kind of blind. We're the truth, like everything is so in our face that we can't really know what's going on. And his whole method was to deconstruct, right? The German term of to destroy, to undo, so that we can actually see what the Greeks meant when they meant being, right? What do they mean by being? And it turns out that they were not separating being like we do, like an object. It was actually a part of their existence. It was a much a part of their life and what drove everything. It wasn't just a scientific thing that we kind of splice and dice and put under a microscope and then come to judgments about it. No, it's actually operating in us as we make judgments. And that's what that's what Heidegger, and then Heidegger's interesting thing was like words. I think he made a discovery through looking at philosophy through hermeneutics when he said, do words have meaning in themselves? No. When you say the word tall and you just say tall, what are you saying? I don't know. It can mean the smallest cup in Starbucks, or it can mean the height of somebody. So word by itself means nothing. It needs a context. It has a history, right? The word tall came to be the way that it sounds in its written form because of history, because of the Germanic language, because of the fights and all of that. And that's how we have today the word tall as we have it today. It's history. And so this whole idea of being in time, right, was that historical movements give form to our languages so much that we as human beings, Heidegger said eventually towards these later works, that being is language, right? That the language is the house of being, he said. And so everything is language according to for us as human beings. And that makes me think like, yeah, like you cannot have anything that's independent. Or for example, words can always adhere different meanings. History doesn't stop, and today what tall means can mean short in the future for all we know. And he was right about that. He was right. That's how language works. But then, and this is connecting what you're saying, that we cannot know. This is where Jacques Derrida comes in, and deconstruction, which is basically what we moderns are. We breathe and live in deconstruction, that we cannot know because language can obtain different meanings. Yeah, Derrida was right in that sense, that we cannot know the absolute end of a word, right? We can't say, oh, this word's going to stop meaning this. It ends here. This word, that's the only meaning this word has. And because of that, Jacques Derrida then said, well, we can't know anything because words always grow in meaning. And it's like, no, Derrida, we can actually know what being meant to the Greeks. Do we use it today the way the Greeks do? No. To us, now it has a whole bunch of associations that, and it didn't have for Aristotle, but we can know through the study of ancient texts and hermeneutics what being meant to Aristotle. And that's what Heidegger tried to do in Being and Time. And so the question then is, just because our language or our being expands, does that mean that we cannot have knowledge? And I don't think the question is no, we can. I think we could have knowledge, but it's always growing, and we always have to, like you said, we always have to keep updated, because the world is it always is expanding. So there's always new phenomena coming in that we didn't perceive because of our biases or whatever, or limitations of our instruments we have. But I think we could have certain knowledge to be able to allow us to live, how to live. The fundamental question of philosophy, what is the good life? I think we could be given that answer. And to put it in very simple terms, don't consume anything that makes your heart stop. Poison, for example, don't get cancer. Don't consume, cancerous substances. Which it's a very difficult question, because science says one day that eating too much cholesterol can be bad, and then another says no, eating not that much is not that bad, and it's like, oh, it could be difficult and annoying. But I think we could know, not in absolute terms, but we could know. I don't follow Jacques Derrida into the idea that knowledge is impossible. I just don't buy that. Like to me, it's like, yeah, words do get new meaning, but it doesn't mean that we don't know the historical meaning as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Zelig. Yeah, the issue of the relationship between understanding and language, and the relationship between language and meaning. Oh, bye, Jenny. Glad you could join us. It's a critical area, and it's one that he explores a lot. So, I give you a little example. The opening of Die Philosophie des Geistes, part 3 of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, he opens with the statement, Die Erkenntnis des Geistes ist my German pronunciation is terrible, and I apologize in advance, ist die konkreteste, darum höchste und schwerste. And his second sentence is Erkenne dich selbst. That's the opening of that sentence. I'm going to paste these into the chat because these matter. So I'm looking at how to translate these words, and I'm looking at the existing translations that are out there. And there are subtleties to this that are not immediately apparent and that teach us things about English. And the first thing to understand is that second fragment, Erkenne dich selbst. Erkenne dich selbst. Guess what that translates as? It translates as know thyself. Know thyself. But it doesn't just translate as know thyself. Those are English words. That is his attempt to represent the ancient Greek gnothi seauton, which means know thyself. This is what's at the Oracle of Delphi. And that's important because gnothi is from gnosis, not from noesis. That is to say, the gods at the Oracle of Delphi are telling you that one of your mental faculties is the one you need to bring to bear here, not the others. They're built into this 2-word admonition that people have been saying to each other for, 2,500, 3,000 years, is a very subtle but important point, which is that you are never going to understand yourself if you only try to do so noetically. You have to dig deeper than that. You have to not just know yourself by recipe or by ideology and, catechism and rote. You have to know yourself by listening and exploring and feeling and really hearing the reality of yourself, even when that contradicts your favorite ideologies and systems and logics and mathematics and so forth, right? It is a deep fundamental statement about the importance of gnosis. And so when we go back to the German, erkenne dich selbst, yourself, erkenne is the German verb that he's bringing to bear to mean gnothi. And erkenne, you see it's there in that first sentence too, die Erkenntnis des Geistes, die Erkenntnis des Geistes. So everybody translates that as the knowledge of Geist, or the recognition of Geist is the concretest and therefore the highest and hardest. And if you think that word is the knowledge of Geist, you think he's just making some sort of claim. If it's the recognition of Geist, like some translators do, then you're not entirely clear what he's saying. The recognition of Geist is the concretest? What? In English, that doesn't make sense. It's not clear what he's talking about. But if you compare the use of gnothi and erkenne, you could translate that as the gnosis of Geist. When you approach the mind, the spirit, Geist, not through ideology, but by paying close attention to the concrete reality, its actual nature and character, you end up with something very concrete. something that's not abstract. It's not arm wavy claims about how the mind works, but it is this incredibly rich, detailed landscape of how the mind actually works. A very different statement, right? But completely erased in almost all English, in all English translations to date. No matter which English word they pick, none of them means gnosis. So it's impossible to pick out the meaning that Hegel obviously worked for and selected. He chose that. He had many German verbs to pick from. And he chose the one that means gnosis. And in case we miss the point, he puts gnothi seauton in the very next sentence. He's giving us everything we need to get the point of what he's trying to say, the distinctions, the all-important distinctions between the different mental faculties. And it's all lost in English, all of it. There's like no hint of it left. But to go to Zelig's point, that was a week ago I was looking at that, and it sent me on a unexpected Googling, Wiktionary, translation, etc. journey to be reminded that we used to have a word that meant this. The word was ken. You see it in Scottish English still, where people will say, I dinna ken that. And when we translate that in English, we mean, oh, it means no, to know that. But that's not what it means, right? Ken, erkenntnis, erkenne, erkannt, all these German words line up with ken in English. The two languages derive from the same source language originally. Ken didn't mean to know noetically, it meant to know gnosically. It was as close to gnothi as we had. And we used to have it in our language. We used to be able to make the distinction between gnosis and noesis in English using the word ken. But it wasn't interesting to the development of modern English. Modern English didn't particularly want us thinking about gnosis. I'll remember irrational things are the source of all badness and rationality is the source of all goodness. So what good is kenning? It's irrelevant. Listen, kenning, there was no need for that word under the modern ideology. And so it faded from the language and we lost it. It's still there, but it's always treated as, a weird, obscure throwback term or as a dialect of Scottish. So what we have here is a case where the meaning and usage of language has drifted over time in such a way that there are things we need to be able to say that we've lost the ability to say. But we could resurrect that word, right? It was English. We could pull it back into English. And thereby, without having to import any German or Greek, we could regain the ability to clearly understand what gnothi seauton means. We could translate that into English. Ken thyself. And we could translate Hegel's opening sentence into English, or at least partial English. The kenning of Geist is the concretist. And thus, we would be rebuilding in English the capacity to make these distinctions that are all important to understand what it is that we're doing when we try to know things. But to do that, you'd have to be willing to, be a prescriptivist and say, I think our language should be able to say these things. And of course, in modernity, there's no sin greater in linguistics than to be a prescriptivist. Prescriptivists are the source of all evil, and everybody knows you should only let the language do whatever it does, and whatever it does, even if all words eventually mean money, poop, or sex, well, that must be good, because that's what happened. Everything that happens is good, and you're not supposed to judge anything. Phil, and then Zelig, and I'm going to take us to the text for our last hour. So go ahead, Phil. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to talk about the relationship between mercantilism and colonialism, but I'm going to skip that because something is more important has come up, in a sense. I know that's important, but nonetheless. And this came about yesterday when I was in a Hegel meeting with a bunch of people, by the way, who knows a lot more about Hegel than I do. But nonetheless, I follow it. And something was interesting because what I saw was, in essence, a comment about the ontological difference. And let me put it this way, Plato sort of, in a sense, began that, in a sense, by positing the idea of the forms. And, and of course, the relationship between the forms and its sort of manifestation and reality, and the difference between the ideas of the form, the pure idea, and this manifestation, in a sense, in the divided line. We are on this side of the divided line, and there's the other side of the dividing line that in some sense we want to know, but we have precious little, if any, access to it, And Donald may disagree with that, because Donald seemed to think that we have mathematics. And I insist that mathematics on this side of the divided line, he thinks is actually at least on the divided line, if not slightly on the other side.
No, Phil, no.
Okay. No.
I agree with you.
Okay,
mathematics is a tune-up for junior students who want to be philosophers.
Okay, I apologize. We
agree.
agree.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
So anyway, there was a distinction between in this Hegel meeting between understanding and concepts. Understanding understands, in a sense, the existential reality. And it really doesn't really understand it, because all that comes to us is through its appearances. And appearances are maybe a kind of image or even a representation of the reality, but is not the real. So we can, this gets to Kant, that we can never know the transcendental object. We could come to know it in a sense, because on the other side, it's always beyond us in the noumena. And so that was the second stage of logic, that in some sense, you could say logos that been transformed into logic, and that in a sense, Kant had come to a dead end by showing what logic could do. And he left the noumenal as something he's not going to touch, because that's sort of like the antinomies, or you could say something that's unexplained. Actually reasonable, he's modest in his regard. And then apparently Hegel says, no, actually we can't broach the noumena, the transcendental or the transcendent. And because that's actually a deep desire of human beings, to not just know the representation, but to know what is really real. And that produced, in a sense, speculative philosophy. We could speculate what is beyond the divided line. Okay, good enough. Unfortunately, speculation, as you see in Hegel, really is backward looking. We understand the history, and we're at the hour now, and we understand how history has unfolded itself. It got us to the present. But how do we speculate and project that into the future? Because history is always backward looking. And so therefore, in a sense, you are prone to make mistakes. If the world can continue to be the way it is and remain stable, then speculation has a better chance. But unfortunately, as you know with history, and Hegel knows this, it's evolving. So therefore, you might be able to account for the part of the past that is pushed into the future, but the future is different. So that part is going to be a mistake. But nonetheless, we desire to know what the future is, because that's important to us, right? And all those other things, like freedom, free will, God, all these other things that are something that is in the realm of superstition, or you could say deep speculation. And in that discussion, I thought, this is interesting, because our desire to know what is unknowable is a deep desire. I mean, it's not just like, oh, just good enough. I just know the way the world is. That's good enough for me. That's not good enough. And I said, this really reminds me of a different interpretation now of the the tree of knowledge. You know, I've always been suspicious when God threw Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. It was how should I say, entrapment. God knew they were going to eat from the tree of knowledge because he made them wanting to go beyond the divided line, right? And so he set them up. And so the fallenness is, in a sense, inevitable because God has set them up. And with this interpretation, it might be that God hasn't set them up. It wasn't a state of fallenness because he wanted mankind to become what mankind is, that he made them to be. Now, I realize this is a myth, but nonetheless, it's interesting development because even after he threw us out of the Garden of Eden, we still want to know. And so, in some sense, God was doing us a favor. Now that you've eaten, because I entrap you into eat, because I want you to become who you really are, to distinguish you from the beast, right? But you have to find that out for yourself, right? Because if I give it to you, then you're not finding out your freedom, your free will, and all that.
Right.
So in some sense, God was not throwing us out of the Garden of Eden. We had to be thrown out in order to become who we are, because we need to find out for themselves. Which, by the way, leads to the fact that, Kenneth Smith says, in essence, the essence of thinking is the question. We want you to question and try to answer the unanswerable. And he doesn't have it. None of us have it. But that is the pursuit of what we're going to do.
Mhm.
Okay, so this will lead me into a kind of interesting thing I'm going to talk about now. The gray swan. I'm not calling it the black swan because I'm uncertain. Okay, now we do know that in modern society, the bedrock of that, at least on a fundamental level, is the economy. How the economy developed, trade and all that kind of stuff, okay? And recently something has developed that's a problem, because late capitalism is no longer about exchange of money, but the promise of debt, the relationship of debt, because it's driven by debt, not money, but debt. And the world, what is it? The Bank of International Settlement, the BIS, which is in a sense the compilations of all the understandings of all of the central banks, has come up with the idea that there is an invisible amount of money that's operating in terms of debt in the exchange market and daily settlement. In a normal situation, no problem, because I promise to pay you back $100 or $1,000 or $1 million. And that's not even recorded in the actual, that's visible. It's a kind of invisible ledger of promises that is actually not part of trade, because we know that we will settle and you pay me back or I'll pay you back. And the debt in the collateral exchange means that it will exchange. However, when so much debt is accumulated, apparently $85 trillion in terms of the reserve currency. By the way, that doesn't mean that America owes $85 trillion. The world owes $85 trillion. And when you add that up, that there's also the pound and the yen and the yuan and other, it's something like $110 trillion that's in the balance sheet of the ledger. Once again, in normal times, trade happens, nothing much happens because the interest rate in the paying back the debt is also calculated already. However, in a situation when the interest rate goes up and money supply is not there to repay the debt, then becomes a problem, because there's going to be a lot of debts in the balance sheet in which the collateral cannot be come up to settle a settlement. Now you could delay it, say, oh, give me a break, like, well, okay, I'll increase my interest rate by 0.5%. I'll give you another year to pay it back. That only kicks the can down the road. Okay, so if the economy is on a downward slope because interest rates are going up, in order to, and I guess, slow down the economy itself cannot generate the money. So we're in this debt trap. Now, I'm not calling a black swan because it might be settled. Suddenly the economy might swing back up, paying the interest payment, no problem. But $110 trillion of debt on the ledger is more money than the whole world makes in a year,
Right.
or 2 years. So therefore, in a sense, if it actually crashes, if the market crashes, we're in a whole hell lot of trouble.
Yes.
The money will deflate.
Yes.
You could always print more money and say, here's $1 trillion. It's only worth 250 billion. And so therefore, the exchange rate would be a problem. This is a looming crisis in the gray swan.
Yes.
I'll say one more thing that's interesting. I'll relate that. Peter Zion, who's a pretty astute globalist. By the way, I don't agree with him in many of the politics, but I do agree with his analysis. He said one thing that's very strange. Well, he said many things, but I'll focus on this thing. He says, doing the the trade problem and the running of drugs. What is it? Chiapas was the guy who handled all of the drugs. And he said it was a mistake to have taken down. Well, that sounds like a strange idea. He says what happened was when Chiapas was running it down, he was running it like a business. Like, don't get involved too much, at least, in violence, because we just want the money, right? And so therefore, since America wants the drugs, we're going to deliver the drugs, but no violence. But when we took Chiapas down, not that he was a good man, but when he took him down, it devolved into these separate little pockets of drug runners who are no longer businessmen, but use violence to create the drugs. And that is going to be a much more chaotic situation than just dealing, well, he's a drug running businessman, right? And therefore, once again, it's based on capital, because these guys want to make money too, but they don't have the structure in order to manage the complexity of this whole network, which, by the way, is related to the relationship between mercantilism and in a sense, colonialism, right? Because it's not a corporate totalizing structure. So therefore, all these gangs are fighting with each other in the meantime, fighting with the government. And he said, if one of these or many of these drug cartels should break the border between the United States, it will actually bring violence to the United States more than just a depletion of money. So that's interesting, So the fact that that is, in a sense, a small indication of the breakdown of the totalizing system, not that I'm for the totalizing system, could devolve into these sectors of mercantile exchanges that breaks into violence in the world. And that might be an indication of the last stage of modernity, because capital, whether you like it or not, is at least holding us together in a whole globalized system. That's what deglobalization means. So there you go. I'm just giving you the gray swan. hope
Thank you, Phil.
hope it doesn't turn into a black swan, right? Because if capital, although many of us know how oppressive it is, if it falls, there's going to be a great period of chaos before we settle into the next stage.
Thank you, Phil. On that note, since we're down to 40 minutes left, I'm just going to take us right to the text. I know Zelig's been waiting, but we only have 40 minutes left to actually begin going through the text. So I think 2 hours and 20 minutes is enough lead in. So my apologies. And here's some text, right? Let's look at where we left off last week. We were in paragraph 3. I want to go back to the end of paragraph 3 to emphasize this point before we go on to paragraph 4, which is that from the ancient perspective, even the Olympians, now we're talking about ancient gods here, right? This is the ancient conception, non-medieval, non-modern, ancient conception of divinities.
So Rick, enough time for the overture. Let's get into the play.
Exactly. We'll have a short play with a long overture. So even the Olympians cannot command events contrary to what is woven in the logic of fate. So when we talk about the fate, of course, we're talking about the 3 fates, Clotho, Atropo, and Lechesis. So the spinner, the measurer, and the cutter. And we're talking about the way that people's lives are woven into the tapestry of history and how it's going to come out. And that the fates are in the process of creating the future through their act of weaving. They don't know the future yet, per se. They might have things in mind, but rather they are step by step doing the weaving. So they're creating the future, which gives them a clarity about the present and about what's about to happen next that's not available to any thread of the weave. As mortals, not only do we not know what's coming, we're not all that clear about what's happening right now. and this is where the fates have a lead on us. But they also have a lead on the gods. They have a lead on the Olympians, the most powerful deities in the ancient Greek pantheon and the ancient Roman pantheon. They are not the ones weaving, right? They're not creating the future. They are anthropomorphic embodiments of great forces of nature. And as such, they are generating the great forces and patterns that are going to shape and create the phenomena to come. But they're not the weavers. They're not the reconcilers. They're not the ones putting things into place. That's the fates. Even, I don't know if this is ever said explicitly in anywhere in the Greek myths or the Greek cosmology, but effectively, in a very different way, in an infinitizing way, even the lives of the gods are being woven into the great tapestry by the fates. The gods themselves have less clarity about the present and the future than the fates do, but they still have more clarity about the present and the future than mortals do. There's levels of insight into the world, and it has to do with, finitude and infinitude. We are more finite than the Olympians. The Olympians are more infinite than we are, but they're not as infinite as the fates, who are always there, always weaving, always shaping. And the result is a really fundamentally different conception of the sacred than anything to come in the medieval or modern world. Nobody thinks this way anymore, and nobody has thought this way for like 1,500 years. It's an extinct way of understanding the world. But it has its advantages. One of the things that happens in the medieval conception of the sacred is that such an unbridgeable gulf is created between the divine and the human that there's no basis for comparison. There's no basis for a relationship. You end up with this just shut up and submit. kind of approach to authority, because the medieval God is infinite in every way, and human beings are finite in every way, and there's no way to cross that gulf. You can see why Christianity had to arise within the Jewish faith to create a bridge between the inaccessible, ineffable, incomprehensible, infinite of the sacred that they were postulating and the finite of a human being. Because without a bridge, how is it relevant to our lives? Can't be understood, can't be reasoned or bargained with. It's too far beyond, it's too alien. So what the ancients have done is they've created a concept of the divine that is already a bridge between the infinite and the finite, because it is infinite compared to us, but finite compared to the fates, who see further, right? The Olympian gods are not omniscient. They know their areas. They know what they represent better than any mortal ever will. Poseidon knows the ocean like no mortal will ever know the ocean. But that's still not enough to be able to, be omniscient about the future the way that the medieval god is. You can see the difference. And it's never entirely made clear whether how clearly the fates understand the distant future. But they know the present and they know the immediate future, which puts them ahead of both mortals and gods. And then he goes on, so even the Olympians cannot command events contrary to what is woven in the logic of fate. One way of saying that is that the fates know where the gods are going to land and they weave around them. And another way of saying that is that the fates are weaving the gods themselves into it. And I don't know that it's ever made clear which is which, but either model fits what he's saying here, fits this ancient perspective. But the next sentence takes us further. Necessity, or Ananke, is the ultimate authority over this world. Ananke was anthropomorphized as an ancient, mysterious, chthonic deity, older, darker, and more potent than the fates. That when the fates are weaving, they are obeying Ananke. She's the real force in the world, another level of infinity above the fates. And in theory, one could argue Ananke has that omniscience that the fates might not have. The fates are closer to omniscience because they know the present, because they're weaving it, and maybe they know the immediate future. But Ananke, necessity, is the one who's driving the fates to weave as they do. According to, as we know from Heraclitus, according to the deep principles of the cosmos, the archai, right? Why do things have to be the way that they have to be? What are the great things? What are the great fountains of order that are unfolding and unfolding and unfolding to create a tree or us or a government? All of this comes ultimately out of the archai and their interactions. And only Ananke knows those interactions. And just as the Greek gods are not supernatural, that is, we did talk about this sentence last week, and Donald said that should probably say supranatural in order to avoid making people think, in modern cliche terms. Just as the Greek gods are not supernatural because they're subject to nature, because Ananke is the ultimate expression of the lawfulness of nature, right? She didn't create the world ex nihilo. Her omniscience is the omniscience of the lawfulness of the world that allows her to know how things must be because of the unfolding of these primeval archai and their order. The gods are not above that. They're not supernatural in that sense. So too, they are not exempt from the skein of fate. They are part of the weave, just like we are. They may be an infinite part of the weave, and they may be all powerful within their domain, but the way they express that power is never the way the medieval god does, where he can do anything he wants to, including just stop things or start things from nowhere. It's always all powerful in the sense that they are, what do I want to say? They are the fountain of order of the archai in question. Not that they could make the ocean do anything they want to make it do, but that they would only ever want to make the ocean do oceanic things. They're never going to say the whole world is flooded. I have said so, the way the medieval god would, because that's not what the ocean does. But certainly the oceans could rise as the glaciers melt and flood all the coastlines around the world. That they could do. That Poseidon could do. It's within the gift. But he's not going to do it at some random point in order to say, I am God, I have spoken. Let me show you puny mortals how powerful I am. Haha, I can do this and you can't. That's a medievalism. That's not an ancientism, if you will. An ancientism here would be to do oceanic things for oceanic reasons. And that's what makes him Poseidon. And in that sense, he's not omnipotent over the ocean, not even over the limited domain of the ocean. He can't make the ocean do anything. He can only express what the ocean was going to do anyway. The power of the ocean is anthropomorphized as Poseidon, but he is not apart from it, aside from it, arbitrarily willing it to do things to show off it, his great power. It's a radically different conception of the divine than the medieval. Radically different. And as such, it's also, and this is hard for moderns, I think it's hardest of all for modern atheists to grok. This is a different conception of the divine than the conception of the divine that atheists rebel against. When an atheist says that they're an atheist, the God they don't believe in is the medieval God, not the ancient God. Because they can't conceive of the ancient God. They have no idea what that's like. They don't know what ancient divinities are like. They assume they must all be some version of the medieval divinity, but they're wrong about that. We're wrong about that. That's not how the ancients saw the divine at all. It's easier to be an atheist against the medieval God, of whom there's only one, and who has all these arbitrary self-contradictory qualities, than it is to be an atheist against the ocean. I mean, if you say, I don't believe in Poseidon to an ancient Greek, he throws you in the ocean, says, do you believe in it now? Are you not in the ocean? Are you or are you not? Are you having trouble with this idea? That's Poseidon. Not Poseidon is some god who has magic powers that let him control the ocean. Poseidon is the ocean. To not believe in Poseidon is to not believe in something that's obviously real and right in front of you. It doesn't make any sense. And the same is true for Aphrodite, right? Okay, you can't exactly point your finger at love and attraction the way you can at the ocean, but human beings, being human beings, are going to not only encounter love and attraction at a deep, visceral level, but we are going to learn about the stories in our history where people did crazy ass shit, pardon my French, out of Aphrodite's domain. And, if you say, well, I don't believe in Aphrodite, all they have to do is point you to those historical events and say, that did not happen. That person did not turn on a dime and do this crazy thing out of affection and attraction. You have never felt love in your life for anything? I don't think so. You're trying to disbelieve in reality, and it doesn't make sense to disbelieve in reality. That's a crazy thing to do. So this is, again, radically different conception of the divine in the ancient world than in the medieval or modern. And it changes our conception of what it would mean to be an atheist, right? To not believe in Poseidon is to claim there's no such thing as the ocean, because in the ancient conception, they are equated. They're not two different things. And that's how all the ancient divinities are. They represent parts of nature. Now, we can argue with whether they've been represented correctly. And this is where we get to the big difference between ancient religion and medieval or modern religion. Medieval religion wants to commit genocide and eliminate all other religions in the hope that if we would all be Christians, then we would have a peaceful world. And for us all to be Christians, all other religions must be exterminated. We call that conversion or evangelism, but what we mean is exterminated. Those religions are gone. Those ways of life are gone. There can only be one. And moderns believe the same thing, only without a God. They believe that all economies other than the modern economy must be destroyed, eliminated, converted, whatever. And that along with that, it means that all cultures that do not make the economy the God of how they organize themselves, how they organize their religion, how they organize their music, everything else, they all have to go. There can be only one. This is part of the medievalism of modernity. We're still genocidal in a way that we don't understand. We call it globalism. So it's hard for us to understand why the Greeks, when encountering the Phoenicians, their first reaction wasn't to try to burn all their temples and stamp them out and convert them. It was to say, so tell us about your gods of the sea, because if you understand the sea more clearly than we do, we're in trouble. And we need to update our conception of Poseidon to make sure we're not missing anything. Like literally for a nation, for a people, I mean, there weren't nations back then, but for a people whose existence was predicated upon seafaring and trade, to screw up your understanding of the ocean was literally to put your whole civilization at risk. And the ancients didn't conceive of themselves as living at the end of history. They conceived of themselves as being mortal. Their culture is mortal. Their civilization is mortal. They're going to die eventually. Eventually there will be no Greeks. No, in the sense of the ancient sense. So their job is to prolong their lifespan and health span as long as they naturally can. And one way to do that is to not be an idiot and step off of a cliff or into a minefield, or to misunderstand the nature of Poseidon when you're sending out your whole generation out on ships onto the ocean. So every time they meet another religion, they're like, tell us more about your gods of the ocean. If there's something that you understand that we don't, we need to know that. Not, how dare you believe something that doesn't satisfy our Noetic recipe or catechism for the nature of gods. You see, there's a rationalism to the medieval conception of religion that is a noesis that is missing in the ancient conception of religion. The ancient conception of religion, gnosis was everything. You had to know, how is it really? Because their gods are gods of real things, not abstract ideas, such as being the god of gods, being the god of, I'm stronger than all gods, I'm smarter than all gods, I'm everywhere, I'm the god of all people. The medieval god, all they did is turn everything up to 11 so that they could argue why you should get rid of all the other gods. But if you take all that stuff back out, you're left with a need to understand, a desperate need to understand, which genocide would get in the way of. Nobody's more conquering than the Romans. Everywhere they go, they're conquering, but everywhere that they conquer, they're like, tell us about your gods. Let's build some temples. Why would they do that? This is a counter-modern thing to do. It's a counter-medieval thing to do. Why aren't they exterminating those religions? Why isn't it convert or die, like Charlemagne later offered to Europe? Because the Romans are afraid that if they don't understand the nature of the divine, then they don't understand the world, and they have thereby shortened the lifespan of Rome. They need to hear about all these deities. And then they need to take that back home and have debates and discussions in Rome with their theologians to say, have we missed something here? Do we need to expand and revise our concept of the divine to take this into account? Because if we need to and we don't, then we're doomed, and we'll deserve to be doomed as an organism of history. We are only justified in continuing to the extent to which we have symathesy. We're in a learning relationship with the world. We sense, we smell, we hear, we touch, and we detect things that are out of sync with what we expected. And then we introspect and think, where did we go wrong? And we revise ourselves, and we generate a new generation of behavior that we hope will be more in harmony with what we've learned through symathesy. This is such a different conception of the sacred and the divine from the medieval or the modern that it's literally inexpressible in modern or medieval terms. Mythos and logos, right? This section is called Mythos and Logos. Mythos is partly about the irrational. That was what I emphasized before. And logos is partially about, the rational. But mythos has the added touch of being about the sacred, being about the divine, the mythic. Tales of gods and heroes, tales of those who are not as finite as we are. Like nature is not as finite as we are. So ultimately trying to understand the nature of things through these stories, that's mythos. As opposed to logos, which is at a more finite level. It's a more human level. It's thinking by rote, by recipe, by logic, by equation. trying to stereotype behavior into rules and understanding the world through those rules. All right, so let's do Zelig and then Phil, since we got through this. Go ahead, Zelig.
I'm reminded of a quote of Nietzsche that I read everything of Nietzsche, and I realized that he was basically like a modern Greek. He wanted to bring Greeks back, and I actually discovered that after reading everything that he had in the philosophers Charles Copplestone, and he categorized Nietzsche as a philosophy of culture, as a philosopher of culture, and there's he's so fascinating when you find passages in his writings where he says, you know, one should have, I think it was in his Will to Power, like the journal that shouldn't have been out, but his sister printed, where he said we should ascribe to have the heart of Jesus and the external of Caesar. To mix these two ideas that was like compassionate, full of love, but yet the external of a despot, right? To me, that fascinated me, and I consumed everything of Nietzsche. And then I ran into this quote with that he touched upon the Huguenots, and then he says, he says that this is what his most perfect opponent is, because he's an antichrist, right? He says that himself. And he says, one cannot deny that the French have been the most Christian nation on earth, not because the faith of the masses has been greater in France than elsewhere, but because the most difficult Christian ideals have there been transformed into men and now remain merely ideas, beginnings, and falterings, right? And that's something that I discovered, that Nietzsche criticized religion because it promoted this false ideology where people just took it and said, oh, I'm a cultural Christian. I need to be a good boy, a good girl. But how do you live that in the world? I don't know. The catechism says that it needs to be a good boy, a good girl. Why are you then living wrongly? Oh, we're all forgiven, right? Jesus just forgives sins. And he's all like, no, you need to take your Christianity serious and see how it applies in the modern world, not how it did in first century Judea, but how does it apply to 19th century, 20th century France?
Right.
And he praised the Huguenots by saying these people actually tried to live out their Christian faith in their era, not in an old dated era with like, it looks like a caricature of Christianity, but an updated modern Christian era that it fights with modernity and tries to apply it as it is to their day, without being fake, right? And from then on, I'm like, Nietzsche really would have been a good Lutheran Protestant had he not accepted becoming a philologist and an anti-theist, right? I'm like, man, Lutheran is a good Protestant. And it brings to mind what you're saying, like this idea that when the Greeks had this conception that the fates themselves humbled the Greek gods, that they were a part of this phenomena, and they were not exempt from that. It taught them that they always needed to be thinking in terms of updating their knowledge, looking for new ways to defend themselves with the changing world, and instead of just adopting this fake view of their gods and their myths, but to constantly be looking for, not stopping, constantly be looking for to be able to survive in this world that you ultimately have no control over. And to me, that's like, that's what Nietzsche, he tries to revive through his works, that we cannot succumb to fakery and just adopt like a blueprint that's dead religion. I think Nietzsche was really against dead religion.
That's right.
He was very much for a Christianity that was very alive and up to date, and understood that they were not in control, and they constantly needed to look for ways to update. To me, that's just fascinating.
It's interesting stuff, isn't it? Yeah, you'll get some of the same stuff out of late Kierkegaard.
Yes.
Take care, Geneva. You'll get the same stuff out of late Kierkegaard when he writes his attack on Christendom. This is where he's had it. He spent his whole life developing Hegelian dialectics into a philosophy of human psychology and culture to be compatible with Christianity. And then the clearer he gets about it, the more he notices that all around him, nobody's living that way. And, he starts to see Christendom as the enemy of Christianity, or, as the
Right.
enemy of Christ's teachings. And you start to get some Nietzschean, shall we say,
Yeah.
essays out of Kierkegaard in the
Yeah.
final months of his life. So it's interesting stuff. Thanks for bringing that up. Go ahead, Phil, come off mute.
Yeah, I thank you for what you giving us an understanding of fate and, well, human beings, the God's nature, fate, and I guess Anke, or what you call it. I don't know if I will ever remember that word, but the deeper fate. So what I find interesting is the relationship that they're both kind of pyramidal in this sense, because modernity has these layers between understanding, cognition, concepts, speculation in a hierarchy, but that hierarchy is built on a kind of like a regular pyramid this way. It seems to me that the pyramid that you're showing is this way. that the deeper or the higher or whatever it is, it's much more expansive. So it's an inverted pyramid. It's kind of interesting that Egyptians didn't ever build an inverted pyramid. that would be interesting. So I find it interesting because as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the relationship of Heraclitus to Parmenides. I've always thought that there has to be some interrelationship between them, but I didn't know how to articulate it, because and the way I would articulate it before this is that they were contrary, or at least paradoxical, right? Now you gave me a different initial understanding, initial speculation about Parmenides. That is the interpretation of being is. I pointed out previously that being is a verb, is a dynamic thing, and is a verb. So that right away already leads me to somehow have some funny thing. Well, to me, on the one level, Parmenides seems to be about everything is still. It's the forms, the ultimate forms, it never moves. But just by analyzing being and is, it seems like it moves. So I have to have a deeper understanding of that, which means that maybe in a mythic interpretation, being, my first thought was this deeper arche, as you say, is more like a force rather than a thing. And if that is the case, then that force manifests downward to Heraclitus in his manifestation of forces. So that's interesting. There's a relation. And as you were saying that, I was saying, oh, that sounds a little bit like what is it? What's our president's name? The guy that was before Bush, Clinton. Okay, remember in Clinton, and he said his final defense was, that depends what is. And I thought that was a tricky defense, but maybe it was like, maybe he actually have something. The question, how do you define what is? So so that was in passing, but nonetheless, I thought that was kind of a deep way to answer that he doesn't want to answer. So being is, so if being is, but it's in this sort of more murky mythic force, then that's completely different from being is as we interpret it as like, like it's static. So that relationship between Parmenides and Heraclitus is much more dynamic than I originally thought. I thought they were contrary. They were much more dynamic. So I'm going to have to like focus a little bit more on Parmenides, and it's like, I remember in the Hegel discussion, well, no, it was in a different discussion about the Greeks, and somebody mentioned, it's unfortunate we don't have, we don't have the complete writings of Heraclitus. We only have fragments. And I said, it is very lucky that we only have fragments, because if we have the whole thing, we will interpret it in a much more static way. Right? The fragments allow all these holes, and maybe he should have wrote it all just in fragments, so that all these disconnects that you have to weigh your way through, rather than the fact that it's all connected. And he gave you the answers already. So
Kenneth Smith thinks he did.
And this guy objected, but he said, I disagree. And I said, well, okay, we disagree at this point. So it's lucky that there was holes left. So thank you very much for opening up that mythic dimension of the deep faith.
Sure.
That it is in one sense static, but also moving. It's a force rather than a thing, which is interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I mean, it's the follow-on quotes that come after we can't step twice into the same river. When he says, because other and still other waters are flowing, he starts to give you a piece of the picture. The river is changing, right? Because it's new waters. But then there's the follow-up that says, into the same rivers we step and do not step. We are and are not. And I feel like we are and are not, and I think Kenneth has said this too, it feels like a direct response to Parmenides. I mean, being is and we are very closely related concepts. And to say, okay, it's true that we are, but it's also true that we are not. That you can't understand becoming and change unless both are true at the same time. And the fact that they look to us like a contradiction doesn't mean that nature doesn't make sense. It means that our finite perspective on the world is inadequate to understand the true paradoxes of the infinite, of nature. So, it's I think that's certainly how Hegel read Heraclitus when in his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and he's talking about the nature of one, the nature of two, and the nature of three. When he gets to three, he says, and now we've arrived at Heraclitus, who can handle both the proposition that something is and the negation that it's not, and can make sense of them and create dynamism and movement. And that's when he says, so I'm taking this and everything else Heraclitus said is the foundation of my entire philosophy. And it's like, that there is a reconciliation between the seemingly incompatible choices of yes and no. In the law of the excluded middle is where all of nature seems to live, through these dynamisms that reconcile them. James, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about. Can you hear me? Yeah, I want to ask you a question about Heraclitus, because there was a reading or interpretation of him by this guy named Long, talking about the mottos of the Greek mind. And he said that Heraclitus was posit that the logos is what is the rational, rationality that can understand the truth of nature and reality. Would that be correct to read Heraclitus as that saying that?
Sort of. I mean, indirectly. it's clear, Heraclitus is very clear about the fact that by the logos, he mainly means the way that nature makes sense and is lawful, whether we understand it or not. His primary definition of the logos is less concerned with what we're doing in our heads, and it's more concerned with what nature's doing. He says, you can see that there's a lawfulness to nature, that it's there. It may be hard to see because nature loves to hide and all the other things he says. And because the God whose oracle is at Delphi neither conceals nor reveals, but gives signs. He's saying you have to work to figure out the hidden harmony of nature. But when you figure it out, you discover that it's lawful. And that's what Heraclitus calls the logos. But after establishing that as his principal definition, he then turns to this idea that human reason is a really fraught proposition, that we have a lot of problems understanding the world, and that primarily, he says, the problems with understanding the world come from our turning away from the shared intelligence of the logos, which is available to everybody because we all live in the same world, turning away from that to the private intelligence of our own walking daydreams, how we think the world works, our ideologies and our fantasies and our wants and desires and so forth. So I think what he does is he postulates the idea that at its best, at its most mature, human reason ought to cling to, through study and search, this deeper logos of the cosmos. And the more we get like that, the more intelligent or wise we become. That seems to be Heraclitus's position. We could, sometime we could do a session. I could walk you through the fragments in question that put that together, but it's all there in Heraclitus.
Yeah, because when you're talking about the gnosis and noesis, I'm just trying to figure out where Heraclitus is settling on, or maybe he just doesn't. He's positing both, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is why Hegel creates the dialectic, so that you start with the two faculties, but then what you're supposed to develop as a mature human being is the third faculty, the Vernunft, this ability to wield gnosis and noesis against each other, so that each one can correct the limitations of the other in a dynamic system, like a bow or a lyre. And although Heraclitus is writing at a time before the late definitions of these terms have emerged in classical Greece, and he's writing a boundary between archaic Greece and classical Greece. The words are still a little fluent. Nevertheless, he definitely clings to gnothi. He alludes to it directly, and he uses conjugations of the verb gnosis in a number of places. So he recognizes at least the Delphic concept that experiential knowledge is of a special variety that the gods want us to not neglect. As far as, he wouldn't use the juxtaposition of gnosis and noesis exactly the way that we do in these discussions as terms. But when you look at his examples of the things he complains about in human reasoning, he sometimes gives examples of naive gnosis, like people who just follow whatever's popular, or who are driven by their appetites or by their private desires or dreams. All of this is naive gnosis in action. And then on the other, he turns and he goes after people who lack wisdom but are very intelligent and highly educated. As much learning does not teach wisdom, he says. He over and over, he goes after people who have a great reputation for knowledge and says they're still not wise. So in doing these two things, he's basically, even if he doesn't use the terms exactly, he's setting up the two forms of intelligence and criticizing them both as half-witted approaches, and then saying what we need to do is both seek out experience and critique it and analyze it, and through those two things triangulates on the logos of nature, which is where real wisdom lies.
Do you see Nietzsche as a kind of a Gnostic philosopher who is critiquing the whole Western tradition of?
There can be no doubt in Nietzsche. I mean, he over and over and over, he's he's talking about vitalism. He's talking about the importance of experience and actually being in touch with reality, in touch with your feelings. He praises the Greeks for their wild emotionalness. And not in the beginning. In the beginning, he's very Apollonian, but by the time his career, moves along and he finishes his learning and his critiques, he's come around to thinking that Dionysus is not the enemy, but a friend. And that modernist culture, by being overly intellectualized, it becomes anesthetized and a kind of living death. And he hates that. Nietzsche makes no bones about it. He hates the living death of the academic intellectual life. He wants people to be, and the only way you can have that juice that he shows us in Zarathustra and that he praises as, the dancing philosopher is by bringing gnosis back into the picture, which has been excluded by modernity.
Well, do you think he was responding to Hegel as for being more of a noetic thinker, as much Kierkegaard was also responding to Hegel? Right?
Yeah, he critiques Hegel. He critiques most philosophers as being overly noetic and then also for being hypocrites, for not being willing to criticize the institutions that pay them, because they know which side their bread is buttered on, and they adjust their thinking as needed. And he says that's partially a noetic thing to do, to fit yourself into a system. So Nietzsche, like all the young Hegelians, Nietzsche is both embracing Hegel's dialectic and also criticizing his application of it as being inadequate, hypocritical, and so forth. And I got to share that critique. When I read Hegel saying that the Chinese are incapable of philosophy because their writing system can't represent anything important, and then you discover that he just saw a picture of the I Ching and thought that was the complete Chinese writing system, and didn't question his own natural knee-jerk assumption that it would be possible for China to exist with the I Ching and no writing. You look at these things, or when you see the way he's Eurocentric, you can see the ways in which Hegel has come a long way from Kant, but that's still his milieu, and there's whole bunches of things he can't question. And the young Hegelians have a field day. Part of why they're young Hegelians is that there's so much good to be found in the dialectic in Hegel, and yet on the other hand, there's so much that Hegel takes for granted and should have applied his own philosophy to, but didn't. Which makes, what does every child want to do with their parent? What does every student want to do with their teacher? They want to surpass them. They want to say, yeah, thank you for all that, but you're not so great either. I could do better. It was fertile ground for the young Hegelians to both embrace and critique. Those are great questions, James. Stephen, go ahead, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just looking at that bit, The Underground Man from Dostoevsky. And this is in league with the existentialists and Nietzsche, that it's easy to see that Nietzsche was a person with a scientific mind, and he was very convinced by the Newtonian concept. But his instincts rebelled against the slavery that trap it had created. And this is something that Dostoevsky expresses in The Underground Man. You can convince me that I'm nothing but a piano key, that I have to conform, but I'm still going to rebel. And this is existentialism. The whole line of them were waving their fist at the Hegelian trap. Not that there wasn't a lot to be learned from Hegel, but he had created a system which crushed the individual. And existentialism was a reaction against that. Or Jordan Peterson, repeats that. He doesn't. There's a nice little YouTube where he's expressing that whole point rather poetically, and it's well worth going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, we're going to wrap up here, even though we only got through 2 sentences. We had a nice ramp up to them, and I think there was a lot to be pulled out of them about the nature of the divine. That sets us up for next week. We're gonna start into the 4th paragraph. I pasted it there in the chat for anyone who wants to preview it, but of course it's also on the link. And this is where now he's now having, in the first 3 paragraphs, set up his general framework for mythos versus logos. He's now going to turn, Kenneth is now going to turn and directly discuss mythos and what it meant to the ancients that it doesn't mean to moderns. That is to say, what are the ways in which when we try to understand the Greek myths, we're almost completely misunderstanding what they were to the ancients and why they had them. We think, and you can see this in Cosmos, the TV, both editions of the TV show Cosmos and anywhere else where the science popularizers, where they will say that ancient myth was primitive attempts at science, which is a grotesque misunderstanding of what it meant to the ancients. So we're about to dive into what it meant to the ancients. So thank you, everybody. And again, I'm going to have to rely this week on David to capture the chat for me. I don't know why I can't do a copy out of here, but I can't. It just beeps at me when I try. So I'll see you all next week, and we'll move on.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.